Azure Blade shimmered into existence in his grip and was immediately swallowed by the shadow. A breath later, the dark blade hit precisely into the concave, discolored cavity in the scavenger's armor. With a crack, the chitin broke, allowing the tip of the sword to sink deep into the scavenger's body. The monster shuddered and then heavily fell to the ground. Sunny was thrown from its carapace, landing in the mud with a roll. That was almost easy. It was already over? As though to answer him, the spell's voice resounded in the air.
You have slain an awakened beast, Carapace Scavenger. Your shadow grows stronger.
Sunny was sprawled in the mud, looking at the sky. He didn't even have to catch his breath since the whole fight took less than 10 seconds from start to finish. No one was dead, wounded, or even bruised. Well, except the scavenger. He didn't imagine a battle running so smoothly. He glanced at the monster's corpse to make sure that it was dead, then summoned the runes and took a look at the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 16 out of 1,000. It seemed everything went perfectly. The mighty awakened beast perished just like that. And although Nephis did most of the work, he was the one to deal the killing blow. He wondered why all of life couldn't be so easy. Sunny got back on his feet and dismissed the Azure Blade. Then he remembered the words Master Jet had once told him. No one can survive in the dream realm alone. Back then, he noted her advice, but didn't believe it. After all, he had always strived to be self-sufficient, not allowing himself to depend on anyone. In Sunny's mind, that was the true meaning of strength. However, now he was beginning to suspect that his logic was flawed. Indeed, having someone to share your burdens meant the difference between heaven and hell here in the dream realm. If he was alone, fighting against a single scavenger might have been the end of him. Similarly, even though Nephis was far more skilled than Sunny, it would have been extremely hard for her to defeat the armored monster alone, being that its weakest point was out of her reach. But together, they had accomplished it with relative ease. The whole was greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, there was strength in numbers that surpassed individual power. In that sense, being able to depend on a group was not a sign of weakness, but on the contrary, an important facet of personal strength. Lone wolves would always be at a disadvantage. That was another lesson to learn. Was it possible he'd only ever valorized the virtues of self-reliance because he had no other option? Sunny walked over to Nephis and checked if she was okay. Apart from slight damage to her makeshift seaweed clothes, everything seemed to be all right. She glanced at Sunny. Memory? He shook his head. Nephis sighed. It seemed that she was a bit impatient to get herself a suit of armor of her own. If Sunny was a gentleman, he would have suggested to loan her the puppeteer's shroud for a while, but alas, he wasn't. The armor was extremely valuable and had cost him a lot. Plus, unlike Changing Star, the picture of Sunny wearing nothing but a seaweed loincloth would have been more disturbing than aesthetically pleasing, so he said nothing. Meanwhile, Nephis headed for the dead scavenger and said without turning her head, "Bring Cassia." With a sigh, Sunny turned around and left the clearing. Soon he approached the place where the blind girl was waiting patiently for their return. Hearing his footsteps, she flinched and raised her head. Sunny? Sunny's brow furrowed. He thought to himself, how did she recognize me? It must be the way I walk. Sunny cleared his throat. Yeah, it's me. Everything is over. Come on, I'll bring you to Nephis. Using the wooden staff, Cassia stood up and turned to him. Are you guys all right? Sunny smiled. Of course. We dispatched that critter in no time. Didn't even get a scratch. Cassia smiled with visible relief. Good. Oh, that's good. Oh, right, the rope. Sunny took the rope and guided the blind girl back to the clearing. On the way, he felt a bit weird. With the delicate girl walking behind him, he couldn't help but think of his little sister. As a toddler, she used to follow him around too, as though they were glued together. As the familiar pain stabbed him in the heart, Sunny gritted his teeth and tried to think about something else. It was all in the past anyway. Back in the clearing, breaking apart the scavenger's carapace. The shimmering soul shard was already in her hand. Without saying anything, she tossed it to Sunny. He caught the crystal and looked at her with surprise. "Why are you giving it to me?" Nephis blinked and stayed quiet for a few seconds. "I don't have pockets." Still a bit bewildered, Sunny put the soul shard into his rucksack. "Oh." He wondered why she wouldn't just absorb the shard. He opened his mouth to ask the question, but she seemed to realize something and added, "We'll divide the spoils later." Sunny nodded. "Ah, all right." Nephis, meanwhile, turned to Cassia and said, after some deliberation, "I was careful." Cassia smiled. The nightmare spell's words played over and over again in Sunny's head.
"Your shadow grows stronger."
Sunny was feeling somewhere in between ecstatic and peeved. Throughout the day, they managed to kill 3 more scavengers, each time with not much risk to anyone except for Nephis. The process was largely the same. After discovering the monster, he would hide in the shadows while Nephis would act as bait. Then, when the time was right, Sunny would stealthily approach and finish the fight with a precise strike of the azure blade. To anyone else, maybe except Castor, dancing around a deadly awakened beast would have been a tall task, most likely ending with the dancer's death. Nephis, however, had managed to do it over and over again, seemingly without too much strain. What's more, her performance was based solely on skill, with no aspect ability involved. In that regard, even Castor couldn't have done better. She was swift, calm, and precise. Every move she made was calculated and perfectly timed. She seemed to innately understand the flow and logic of combat, which gave her the ability to roughly predict what actions the mindless beasts would perform in the next seconds. Then it was just a question of physical prowess to evade and even manipulate them to a certain degree. Sunny had always known that skill and experience were more important than raw power, but by watching Nephis, he vividly understood just how vast the difference between them was. Even though his divine aspect allowed Sunny to exert more strength and speed than Changing Star, in an actual fight, he would never stand a chance. Of course, he was also an important part of every encounter. His role as the finisher was not trivial, and not just anybody would have been able to accomplish 4 kills with 4 strikes. Even though Sunny was not taught any elaborate techniques, he was still a somewhat experienced fighter. He had good physical coordination, combat intuition, and, most importantly, a cool-headed mentality. Not to mention the fact that they were only able to ambush the scavengers so effectively due to his shadow scouting them in advance. All in all, it was almost equal cooperation. Still, watching Nephis fight was nothing short of sobering. Trying not to get too dejected, Sunny summoned the runes. It read, Shadow Fragments, 22 out of 1,000. He'd earned 8 just today, which in his evaluation was excellent. Currently, they were waiting on the edge of the labyrinth path, leading directly to the giant statue of the Headless Knight. There was a group of scavengers between them and the statue, moving past without any haste. The sunset was near, but they still had time. Slowly, minutes flowed by. At some point, Nephis gave the command to move. Helping Cassia along, Sunny followed Changing Star and quickly traversed the open space between the labyrinth and the statue. Now they only had to get on top of it. However, it wasn't that easy. Scaling the 700-foot-tall monument would have been hard in normal circumstances, but now they also had to somehow pull Cassia up. Leaving her behind until they were at the top would not have been safe. In the end, Nephis and Sunny took turns pulling the rope every 20 meters or so. Cassia would hold onto the rocks and wait until they climbed higher, and then the process would repeat. It was slow and torturous, and by the end, Sunny's muscles were sore and almost on fire. But they managed to get to safety before the dark waters washed them away. As the night began to descend, the 3 sleepers sat in the center of the circular stone platform and rested. As they did not bring any materials to make a fire, and it was already too late, there was no way to cook food. They ended up chewing on the strips of dried meat, passing the bottle of limitless water around. After some time, Nephis gave Sunny a sign to take out the spoils of today's journey. He took out the 4 shimmering soul shards and put them on the ground. Without any discussion, Changing Star moved 2 crystals in his direction and took 2 for herself. Then she gave one of hers to Cassia. Sunny watched it in silence. By the time Nephis and Cassia had absorbed their soul shards, he still hadn't made a move to take his. After a while, he took another crystal out of the rucksack and moved all 3 to Nephis. The silver-haired girl looked at him with surprise. "Don't you want to grow stronger?" Sunny grinned. "Of course I do. But these won't do me much good right now. It's no secret that you're the main fighting force of our group." He sighed. "The stronger you are, the better our chances of survival will get. Plus, it's not a gift. It's a trade." Nephis raised an eyebrow. "A trade? What do you want?" Sunny, deliberating for a few seconds before answering. "It's rather simple. I will give you these soul shards, and all other soul shards I can earn on the way to the castle." Then he looked her in the eyes and said, "In return, you will teach me how to fight." Nephis smirked at Sunny. "Do you think you can handle it? I won't take it easy on you." In earnest, Sunny wasn't sure. Nephis's skills were so far above his that she may run him ragged. He may be weak and sore and in constant pain, but he was the one who brought up the idea. He felt his stomach flip and feared that he'd just gotten in way over his head. Nephis sat across from Sunny and held the soul fragments in her hands. He'd just offered them to her in exchange for training, and she seemed ready to take him up on the offer. Only, given her cool and readable reaction, Sunny was no longer certain that this was a good thing. Sunny felt a bit nervous under her gaze, knowing that he was being evaluated. With Changing Star's skill and insight, it wasn't hard to imagine just how much she had gleaned from his battle performance. Both his current level and future potential must have been pretty much laid bare in front of her. Were they enough to make teaching him worth her while? After some time, she took the soul shards and nodded. "Okay." Sunny smiled, congratulating himself on a successful deal. Not only did he receive a lot while not losing much, but he also managed to create a bit of a favorable impression of himself in the eyes of Nephis and Cassia. As far as performances went, this was a great one. Sacrificing the soul shards cost him nothing. They were useless to him. And yet, now he seemed charitable and team-oriented. Sunny was proud of the fact he'd managed this light deception despite his clear conscience flaw. He felt like he was finally starting to get a hang of this. Sunny rubbed his hands together. "So, when do we start training?" Nephis shrugged. "Now." Sunny blinked. Was she serious? He assumed she must be. In their time together, he'd never seen Nephis joke or be sarcastic in any way. Still, after their arduous trek and day of fighting scavengers, this seemed like an inopportune time to begin sparring. Sunny glanced at the sun, which was already almost gone. Were they going to train in complete darkness? It wasn't really an obstacle for him. Changing Star, however. "We will start with some words. That will be enough for today." Nephis looked back over at Cassia, who didn't know what to do with herself. "Cassia, you listen too." Sunny and Cassia turned to Nephis, listening to her like 2 obedient students. Despite the fact that they were all roughly the same age, Sunny and Cassia knew that, in terms of martial prowess, their companion had authority that was beyond theirs, as a dragon's might was beyond that of a worm. Nephis thought for a while, choosing her words carefully. "Mastery of combat can be divided into 2 aspects. One is the body, and the other is the mind. Training the body is not easy, but it is rather simple. All you need is repetition and experience. In a fight, things happen so quickly that a fighter can't consider every detail at the moment. That's why your technique must exist in your muscles and bones, so much so that it almost becomes an instinct." Nephis dragged her gaze across Cassia and Sunny. She was pleased that they were giving her their full attention. She continued, "You can achieve initial results through repetition. Then, it must be cemented through experience. The more battle experience you have, the deeper your technique will be assimilated into your body. There is no other way. 1,000 hours of training won't be as impactful as one real fight. Only those who survive countless battles can be truly in command of the body. To Sunny, this explanation simultaneously made a lot of sense and no sense at all. On the one hand, the principle of improving through practice was quite logical. On the other hand, Changing Star's statement made it seem like all those lofty legacies with their years of training were nothing but harmless children. After all, no matter how good their tutors were, they had no real battle experience. But then again, she did wipe the floor with every one of them, excluding Castor, with no apparent difficulty. So maybe her statement was true. That, however, posed a question of its own. Just what kind of life had Nefis led to possess rich battle experience at the tender age of 18? Sunny thought to himself, maybe she's not such a princess after all. Nefis paced, looking far more the general than the princess. Training the mind, however, is not simple at all. That is because once you reach a certain level of skill, the mind is where the true combat takes place. The outcome is often decided before your body begins to move, and to master the mind, the first step is to understand the essence of combat. However, very few people truly do. She stopped sharply and spun towards Sunny. What do you think that essence is? Sunny hesitated. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He'd never heard the phrase essence of combat before. It seemed so abstract. There had to be a right answer, otherwise Nefis wouldn't have asked. If it was some other legacy, he would have been tempted to say something stupid like honor, valor, or duty. But he already knew that Nefis did not fall into the image of a noble aristocrat he had in his mind. She wasn't someone who followed empty words. After a minute or so, Cassia finally spoke up. Victory. And almost at the same time, Sunny responded, survival. Changing Star shook her head. No. Then she rubbed her neck and pierced them with a cold, fierce gaze. The essence of combat is murder. Cassia flinched and opened her eyes wide. Sunny frowned a little. Nefis, however, did not seem to care. In the same calm tone, she continued, at the core of it, there is only this. You are trying to kill your opponent, and they are trying to kill you. In the end, one of you will be killed, and the other one will be the killer. Everything else is just noise. Her words sank deep into Sunny's heart and reverberated there, causing something inside of him to resonate and awaken. Style doesn't matter. Weapons don't matter. Reason and intent do not matter. The only thing that matters is to be the last one standing. In this way, anything you do in combat must be viewed as only serving one of two purposes, either to kill your enemy or to prevent the enemy from killing you. Nefis lowered her eyes. If you can understand that, you will have enough clarity to master the mind. The speech revealed something in Nefis that Sunny had failed to note earlier. It wasn't that she was malicious or even particularly brutal. Nefis could see to the core of an issue. She wasn't impressed with any fancy words or flowery language. She understood the nature of what made the world turn at its most basic. In Sunny's experience, kids didn't get that kind of insight the easy way. She was a woman without pretense, and he was more convinced than ever there was some tragedy at the heart of it all. Obviously, her whole family had died, and yet Sunny got the feeling it was more than that. Nefis sighed. Take these words to heart. Sleep on them. We can start physical training in the morning. After Nefis's speech, Sunny couldn't fall asleep for a long while. He lay on the cold stone, looking into the darkness and thinking about what Nefis had taught them. Repetition, experience, clarity. These were the three keys to becoming a fearsome warrior. All three were important, but the last one was the most vexing. Was every battle really as simple as Changing Star had made it? Was there nothing at the core of being a warrior other than the cold will to kill? Intuitively, he felt that it was indeed so. This ruthless truth was, in a sense, an amalgamation of all his life experiences. After all, for someone like him, life was nothing but a constant battle for survival. Someone always won, and someone always lost. The former got to live for a few more days. The latter, no one cared what happened to them. Of course, life was life, and combat was combat. To most people, they weren't one and the same. But what about the awakened? The sole purpose of their existence was to fight against the nightmare creatures. Very few could escape that fate. After coming to the academy, Sonny allowed himself to think that he had escaped the fate of always having to struggle at the edge of survival. But now, it seemed like he had just exchanged one battle for another. This was an uncomfortable thought. However, if he looked at it from a different perspective, did it actually mean that he always had a crucial advantage? Most of those chosen by the spell were forced to somehow adjust to this merciless way of life. But he had always lived like this. Was he actually one of the few perfectly suited to be an awakened? With this thought, Sonny fell asleep. Sonny's eyes snapped open. An ear-piercing scream rang out in the early morning hours. His heart thumped in his chest, and his palms started to sweat. What the hell happened? Had some nightmare creature found them up here? The shout roused Sonny from his slumber, and he was on his feet even before fully waking up. Somehow, Azure Blade was already in his hand. His shadow was hovering beside him, ready to either wrap itself around the sword in case he needed to attack, or around his body, in case it was already too late for that. He tried to understand what was going on. Nephis was nearby, her long sword raised in a defensive stance. Cassia was nowhere to be seen. Had something got her while they slept? Sonny feared he might see giant tentacles reaching for them from the darkness. But it was better to know if something was out there. Leaning on his night vision, he looked around. The eastern horizon was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn, adding a tiny shade of gray to the blackness of the world. In that blackness, there were no signs of danger. Finally, he saw Cassia. The blind girl was stumbling at the edge of the platform with a horrified expression on her face. With her blonde hair in a mess, she was stretching her hands out, clearly lost in space. Of course, there were no walls for her to find. The platform was opened to the elements. And the only thing waiting for Cassia was a plunge into the dark, tumultuous waters. Before Sonny knew what he was doing, he was already running. That wasn't a very smart thing to do. After all, he did not know what had caused Cassia to scream, or if there was some hidden danger nearby. Plus, it was still too dark for Nephis to see. His sudden lunge could have caused her to lash out with the sword before asking questions. All of these were good reasons to wait and observe first, but in an uncharacteristic and completely irrational manner, Sonny acted before thinking. He caught Cassia moments before she took a step off the platform, and, holding her tightly in his arms, dragged the blind girl back. She let out a confused gasp. "I got her!" Sonny yelled, letting Changing Star know that there was no need to stab him with a sword. And then, in a quiet voice, he said to Cassia, "I got you. It's all right. Everything's fine. Calm down." He felt the girl's body trembling and looked around again, trying to understand what had scared her so much, but there was nothing. Nephis was listening to the sea for the same reason. After a few seconds, she asked, "Do you see anything?" Sonny helplessly shook his head. "No." He helped Cassia sit down in the center of the platform, while Nephis stood guard above them. He looked the blind girl over to make sure that there were no wounds on her body. Everything seemed fine. "She's not hurt anywhere." Cassia remained eerily silent during the whole exchange, still in the grips of a deep fear that made her breathing shallow and her body tremble. Changing Star looked down. Although her face remained indifferent, he could tell that she was a bit flustered. After a second or two, she asked in something that might have been her version of a calming tone. It sounded pretty much exactly the same as usual. "Cassia, what happened?" Magically, that did seem to calm the blind girl down a little. at least enough for her to speak in a quivering voice. Cassia extended one hand and pointed down. The head. I saw. Oh, gods. Sunny frowned and looked at Nephis.
Did she see a vision? The past?
The tall girl was silent for a moment. I don't know. It never happened before. Both of them turned to Cassia, not sure what to do. Since there was no apparent danger, they took turns trying to calm the horrified girl down. However, after that one sentence, she fell quiet and refused to speak again. Nothing seemed to help. After a while, Nephis sighed. Let's leave her be for now. Maybe she needs time. Sunny was about to retort, but, truth be told, he didn't have any ideas either. In the end, he just nodded.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on her.
Changing Star, however, had other ideas. As the sun was rising and the surging sea was receding, Nephis chose to give Cassia some space and led Sunny to the edge of the platform. However, she made sure to always have the blind girl in the periphery of her vision. Cassia sat hugging her knees. Her eyes were closed, but small tremors that periodically ran through her body betrayed that she was awake. Sunny's eye twitched.
Are you sure it's okay to leave her like this?
Nephis gave him a complicated look. Yes. Then, after some thought, she added, Cassia is strong. Sunny wasn't sure what to make of Nephis's evaluation. If Changing Star considered someone to be strong, then they most likely were. However, strong was the last word that came to mind when he thought about the delicate, beautiful blind girl. Wasn't she someone who constantly needed their help? But then again, there were different kinds of strength. Cassia was still alive and sane, despite her debilitating flaw. How many people could have done the same? Sunny shrugged.
If you say so.
Then, Nephis made him summon the Azure Blade. After studying it for a while, she nodded and took her longsword out of the air. Despite its size, it was an elegant weapon. The narrow, double-edged blade was much longer than that of the Azure Blade, with an incredibly sharp, symmetrical tip. The whole blade, as well as the simple cross-shaped guard and the pommel, seemed to be made out of silver and reflected the pale morning light. The handle was tightly wrapped in black leather. Nephis placed her sword alongside his blade. Your sword can be used with one hand, but its true potential can only be revealed when held in both. It is created primarily for cutting and severing, hence the higher center of gravity. However, it can thrust as well. Then she gestured to hers. My sword is a bit more versatile. It is created for both cutting and thrusting, and it has a double edge. However, the principle of wielding these two swords is effectively the same. She took the sword in both hands, placing one near the guard and another near the pommel. Then she performed a downward slash. They are both leverage-based weapons. When held with two hands, one hand pushes. She pushed the sword downward with the hand near the guard, while the other hand pulls. The hand near the pommel simultaneously pulled the handle up, giving the blade a tremendous boost in speed. This is how you generate force and perform powerful strikes. Now, your turn. Sunny looked at his sword and gripped it with both hands, mimicking Nephis's pose. Then he raised it and slashed it down, making sure to enhance the force of the strike with his lower hand. Changing Star observed him. You need to understand that a strike doesn't come from the hands. It comes from your whole body. Power comes from your feet, your hips, your core, and your shoulders. And it is only then transmitted to your hands. Like this. She demonstrated the downward slash again. This time, Sunny paid attention to the overall stance and movements of every part of Changing Star's body, as opposed to only the sword. He wasn't a novice to fighting. Instinctively, he already knew how to deliver a proper punch. Even if, before, there wasn't a lot of strength in his body, the principles of striking with a sword were largely the same, so Sunny quickly understood the overall concept. He performed the simple downward slash a few more times. After each time, Nephis gave him pointers and corrected his mistakes. Sometime later, she was finally satisfied with his form. Good. Sunny smiled, proud of his achievements. Nephis looked at him thoughtfully and nodded. Now do it 1,000 more times. The smile froze on Sonny's face. 1,000? Did she say 1,000? He blinked.
Sorry, how many times?
Changing Star tilted her head and thought for some time. Well, we don't have much time today, so yes, only 1,000. Sonny was floored. He thought,
Only 1,000?
but he forced himself to sound polite.
I see. All right.
As Nephis walked back to sit with Cassia, he turned to the sea and raised his sword.
1,
The azure blade whistled as it cut the air. He raised it again.
2,
Push and pull. This is how you generate force.
3,
Strike with your whole body, not just your hands.
4.
Sonny raised his sword and slashed down, over and over again. Only one thought eventually remained in his mind.
Repetition, experience, clarity. Repetition.
And so Sonny pushed himself onward and onward. He sliced through the air until the movement was instinctual, until his muscles were sore and his forearms ached. He sliced through the air until he heard nothing but the ocean and forgot for half an instant what a dangerous place he was in. After his 1,000th strike, Sonny turned and padded back towards Nephis. To Sonny's shock, Cassia was no longer cowering. She was on her feet, a grave look on her face. She whispered,
There's something you both need to know. Something that I saw.
Thanks to his training, pretty much every muscle in Sonny's body was still sore as he walked over to the girls. He collapsed to the ground with a groan.
Ugh.
After catching his breath, he looked at Cassia.
Cassia, so you feel better?
The blind girl slowly nodded.
That's a relief.
He shifted and hesitated for a bit. Cassia didn't look too well. Her face was still very pale, with a distant, dazed expression on it. Her body, at least, was no longer trembling. Sonny wasn't very good at talking to people, let alone placating them. He wasn't sure what to say. He cast a gaze at Nephis and sighed inwardly. Who knew that one day he would turn out to be the most sociable person, for as far as the eye could see? What a joke.
Can I have some water?
Cassia turned to him and scowled, as though confused by the question. Then she suddenly gasped and opened her eyes wide.
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. Cassia.
She summoned the limitless water bottle and offered it to Sonny. He took it with a grateful smile and greedily drank a few gulps before giving the bottle back to Nephis. Eventually, Nephis returned it to Cassia. You drink some too. After she did, Sonny awkwardly patted the blind girl on the shoulder.
Everything seems to be fine now. So, you mentioned having another vision?
Cassia hesitated a beat.
I think it was a vision. It could have just been a nightmare on second thought.
Sonny and Nephis exchanged glances. They both doubted that what Cassia saw was a simple nightmare. After all, people usually do not dream in the dream realm. The blind girl gathered herself.
I don't remember all of it. Just fragments.
Sonny carefully considered his words, not wanting to pressure Cassia too much.
You can just tell us what you remember. Maybe we'll be able to make sense of it together.
Cassia sighed and tentatively nodded.
At first, I saw a boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Something vast was churning in the darkness. I felt like if I directly saw it, I would lose my mind. As I watched, terrified, the seals broke one after another until only one remained. And then that seal broke too.
She trembled a little.
After that, I don't know. It was as though my mind shattered into 1,000 shards, each shard reflecting its own image. Most of them were dark and scary. Some I have already forgotten. The other...
Cassia fell silent, remembering.
I saw the human castle again, only this time it was at night. There was a lonely star burning in the black skies, and under its light, the castle was suddenly consumed by fire. The rivers of blood flowing down its halls. I saw a corpse in golden armor sitting on a throne. A woman with a bronze spear, drowning in a tide of monsters. An archer trying to pierce the falling sky with his arrows.
Sunny subtly checked on Nephis, who kept a stiff and unreadable expression. Cassia, however, seemed more horrified by each word.
In the end, I saw a colossal, terrifying crimson spire. At its base, 700 heads were guarding 7 locks. And at the top, a dying angel was being consumed by hungry shadows. When I saw the angel bleed, I suddenly felt as though something so precious that it can't be described with words was taken from me.
Her voice became quieter.
Then, I felt so much sorrow, pain, and rage that what little remained of my sanity seemed to disappear. That was when I woke up, I think.
Nephis and Sunny remained silent for a while, trying to make sense of what Cassia had told them. If Nephis had an idea what any of that meant, she didn't show it. Sunny couldn't even begin to decipher the hidden meaning behind the vision, if there even was one. Cassia's previous vision of the castle seemed pretty much straightforward. It showed her a human fortress and even the direction in which it was situated. This time, however, her dream was disjointed, full of weird symbolism and vague, uncertain images, much more like a charlatan's prophecy than a vision gained through an aspect ability. Sunny sighed. Maybe it actually was just a nightmare. Your previous visions weren't like this, right? Cassia silently shook her head. Sunny scratched the back of his head. Well, people don't usually dream in the dream realm, but you do. Perhaps seeing a random nightmare once in a while is a side effect of your ability. The blind girl turned to him, a faint relief written on her face.
You really think so?
He hesitated, trying to find the right words. Why not? It's a possibility. Inwardly, however, he felt uneasy. She had mentioned a dying angel being consumed by shadows. Why did that sound so ominous? Sunny wondered what had become of his life that such a sentence didn't even seem that insane anymore. With that, they were finally ready to welcome a new day. Sometime later, they were sitting on the western edge of the stone platform, looking at the scavengers below. Sunny's shadow was busy scouting a path to the next high landmark. The scavengers skittered around, blobs in the distance, but pretty dangerous up close. Nephis frowned. Were there always that many? Sunny glanced at Nephis and shook his head. No, there were much more. They seem to be almost done with the carcass. I doubt it will last until nightfall. This meant that by tomorrow, all these beasts would be roaming the labyrinth, making it hard for the 3 sleepers to make any progress. It would be best to leave today and put some distance between themselves and the horde before the scavengers were done with their feast. However, without scouting a path in advance, there was a chance of not making it to safety in time. Both options were risky. Nephis frowned, seemingly thinking the same. I don't want Cassia to spend another night near this statue. Let's leave now. Sunny thought for a while, then opened his mouth to offer his opinion. However, a sudden commotion below prevented him from speaking. Down at the bottom of the disappearing sea, amidst mounds of broken coral, the carcass of the giant shark-like monster, the remaining half of it to be precise, was almost stripped of meat, and between its white bones, something was shimmering in the mud. 2 extremely large, luminescent crystals. Sunny's eyes opened wide. Are those... Nephis's hand instinctively went to her longsword. Yes, shards of 2 transcendent soul cores. Sunny couldn't believe it. There was not 1, but 2 transcendent soul cores almost within reach. Suddenly, he was simultaneously filled with greed and fear. Greed because of how rare and precious transcendent soul shards were. Fear because the giant shark turned out to be a corrupted devil at least. One corrupted devil, if not stopped by a saint or a large number of awakened, could potentially destroy an entire city. Sunny belatedly realized that he was much closer to death on that first night than he had previously thought. Sunny swallowed. Should we... Nephis held up a finger. Wait and listen. He stared at Nephis, then obediently listened to the distant, barely audible clamor of the scavengers. After a while, he noticed some disharmony in it. Nephis suddenly tensed up. There. She pointed in the direction of the labyrinth. After concentrating on it, Sunny was finally able to notice two massive shadows stepping out of a particularly wide passage. A second later, the creatures casting those shadows appeared in sight. Sunny gulped. Damn. The monsters looked like the scavengers, but not quite. To start with, they were much larger, towering above the surroundings at more than 3 meters of height. Their carapace seemed to be thicker. They were colored in deep black and scarlet, like an ancient armor drenched in blood. Here and there, viscous-looking spikes were growing out of the carapaces, making their every move much more dangerous. Additionally, instead of heavy pincers, their upper arms ended with long, curved, terrifying bone scythes. Sunny felt cold sweat running down his spine. What the hell are those things? Nephis tilted her head. Monsters, I guess. Nightmare creatures with one soul core were called beasts. They were dangerous and strong, but mindless. If they were able to develop or were created with a second core, they became monsters. Monsters were much more devastating and possessed some rudimentary warped form of intelligence. They were the next step in a nightmare beast's evolution. And these two seemed to be bigger, deadlier versions of carapace scavengers. Sunny and Nephis watched as the two monsters approached the carcass. The scavengers were visibly afraid of them, rushing to get away. Those who were too slow were mercilessly thrown to the side or cut apart by the bone scythes. Rivers of azure blood were flowing into the mud. Sunny wondered if these monsters somehow understood the value of a soul core. Is that what drew them here? Finally, the monsters reached the carcass. Each of them took one of the shards. However, instead of absorbing them, they simply turned around and carried the precious crystals away. The scavengers made their way, following the shards with their little hungry eyes. Sunny blinked and looked at Nephis. Do we still leave now? Changing Star frowned and hesitated. A few moments later, she shook her head. No, we'll go tomorrow. Then she turned west and observed the retreating monsters. Get your shadow to follow these two back. Sunny felt his stomach drop. Nephis meant to hunt those Goliaths? Surely they'd be killed. The monsters that had emerged from the labyrinth were utter nightmares. They had been huge and vicious, even to their kind, and Sunny was simply pleased the beasts had left them alone. Nephis wasn't so easily contented. She looked at Sunny. Can you scout ahead? See what those nightmare creatures want with the soul cores. Sunny frowned. He stood at the edge of the platform and tried to get a good look at the bizarre coral maze they were up against. He knew the creatures had been heading west, but given their size, they were surprisingly fast. Because of the shadow fragments Sunny had absorbed in the last few days, the range of his shadow control had increased a little. However, it was still far from being enough to explore deep into the labyrinth. He shook his head grimly. I don't know how much help I can be. All I know for certain is that they went that way. Sunny pointed to the west and prayed Nephis would let the subject drop. Nephis was quiet, deliberating in her shrewd, unreadable way. After a moment, she sighed. The day promises to be full of hardship, and our bodies weren't able to recover well last night because of the commotion. We should take some time to rest here. There is no telling where we might find safety ahead. Sunny felt his whole body relax. Nephis didn't want to hunt the colossal beasts. At least, not right away. He lowered his back against the cool marble of the statue and stared up at the gray sky above. Cassia was sitting beside him, lost in her thoughts. Nephis was meditating. At least, that's what it looked like. She might as well have been asleep for all Sunny knew. After a while, Cassia turned to him. Sunny? He tilted his head to look at her. Yeah? The blind girl hesitated. Do you think we'll be able to return home? Sunny glanced at her and furrowed his brow. A few seconds later, he turned away and looked at the sky again. Sure. Cassia smiled. You really think so? Why? Sunny grumbled internally. He could tell she was looking for emotional support, but He didn't know how that was his job. He tried to find the right words. Because of her. He pointed at Nephis and winced a second later. Cassia was blind. She wouldn't see where he was pointing. Though Nephis was the only other person with them, so even without the visual cue, Cassia would pick up on his meaning. He shrugged off his embarrassment and continued, I'm also not someone to die easily. In fact, I'm willing to bet you couldn't have found a better duo of sleepers to escort you across the dream realm. If anyone can survive this, it's us. So, yeah, I think our chances of making it back are pretty high. Cassia suddenly giggled. Aren't you a little too full of yourself? You were in the second to last place. Sunny shrugged. That's only because someone smart told me to keep a low profile. Otherwise, I would have ranked higher. Then, with a grin, he added, much higher. Third to last, at least. The blind girl couldn't help but laugh. The melodic sound of her laughter made Sunny feel much better. He had not heard anything like that ever since coming to the dream realm. It was nice to see that people were still able to preserve a bit of mirth, even in this hellish place. Come to think of it, this was the first time he heard Cassia laugh at all. Back in the academy, she was always dull and bleak. After this sudden outburst, Cassia's expression slowly turned wistful. What do you miss the most about home? Sunny tried to think of something, but failed. He wasn't sure that he even had a home in the real world. The tiny room he had been renting previously was nothing but a temporary shelter from the rain. As for the real world as a whole, his life there wasn't that pleasant either. I don't particularly miss anything. Cassia was very surprised. Really? You don't miss your family? Sunny smiled. I don't have a family. Well, I guess I have a sister somewhere. But we haven't seen each other in many years. Cassia chewed her lower lip. Oh. The blind girl was quiet for a beat, but began to speak again before the awkwardness got too intense. I miss my family the most. There was a longing and sadness in her voice. Mom and Dad must be really worried about me right now. No, actually they wouldn't be worried. They would be heartbroken. They must think that I'm as well as dead already. Sunny glanced at her and sighed. You seem to care about them a lot. Cassia turned to him in confusion. Of course. Isn't it normal? Sunny stared at the gray sky. The wind smelled of rain. I wouldn't know. In the evening, Nephis made Sunny perform 1,000 strikes again. After that, they ate the last strips of dried scavenger meat and took turns sleeping, so that one of them could always keep an eye on Cassia. Thankfully, nothing happened during the night. When the morning came and the dark sea retreated, Nephis turned to Sunny and Cassia. We've had time to regroup, and if we spend any more time on the statue, it'll become a liability. Sunny knew that Nephis was right. He enjoyed the relative safety of this place, but lingering here for too long would turn that safety into danger. The group gathered what little they had in way of supplies. Nephis peered over the edge. Today will be different from before. There will be much more scavengers roaming the labyrinth. We might not be able to create an ambush or avoid fighting several of them at once. She looked at Sunny. If anything happens, your job is to bring Cassia away. We can retreat by using passages that are too narrow for the scavengers. If we get separated, proceed to the high point by yourselves. Don't wait for me. Do you understand? With a somber expression, he gave her a nod. Nephis returned it. Good. Time is of the essence, so let's go. With that, she began the descent. After Nephis reached a point 20 or so meters below them, she found purchase and waited. Using the golden rope, Sunny lowered Cassia down. Just like while climbing up, they took turns helping the blind girl. Luckily, climbing down the statue was much easier. Soon, they reached the ground. Entering the labyrinth, the trio moved forward with haste. The shadow was ahead of them, scouting for monsters and optimal paths. Despite that, their progress was slow and chaotic. They had to constantly change direction to avoid groups of scavengers, often ending up in dead ends or moving further away from their destination. Sunny, who played the role of the scout and navigator, felt his brain slowly starting to boil. At some point, however, they inevitably ended up in a situation where a fight was unavoidable. There was a large group of scavengers at their heels, and a pair of them blocking the path ahead. Neither of the two groups had noticed the sleepers yet. However, since there were no other passages to turn into, it was only a matter of time. Nephis considered their options for a few seconds. There was a scowl on her face. "If there's only two, we can take them." Sonny looked at her with uncertainty in his eyes. "But there's no time to set up an ambush." He wasn't quite sure how they could fight two scavengers at once. Despite how good of a teacher Nephis was, he only practiced with the sword for a day. Facing against a scavenger alone was risky. Changing Star shrugged. "It's almost the same. I'll attack first. You follow behind in the shadows and finish one off once they turn. Then, we kill the second one together." The whole plan was based on the assumption that Nephis could survive under the onslaught of two scavengers, both attacking her simultaneously. Sonny was very impressed by her prowess, but he wasn't sure that it was possible. There was a large probability that Nephis would die, and if they lost Nephis, Sonny and Cassia's odds of escaping the Dream Realm dropped dramatically. Sonny remembered that Nephis wasn't present in Cassia's first vision, but what else could they do? Sonny glanced behind him. He could hear the roiling of a pack of scavengers. Turning back would only force them to take on a whole group of these beasts. A bit rattled, Sonny gritted his teeth. "All right, let's go." Nephis summoned her sword and charged into battle. Cassia rested her palm on the rough coral and squeezed into the small alcove of the maze. She was annoyed at how helpless she constantly felt, but the last thing she wanted was to be a hindrance to Nephis and Sonny when they battled the scavengers. She could hear the beast's distant legs cracking and creeping. But as she pushed past that, she could also hear the faint but determined footsteps of her companions. Nephis held her longsword at her side and proceeded toward the two hulking silhouettes ahead of her. She walked with a fire and determination. With her lips pursed together, Nephis threw over her shoulder. "Keep up." Sonny lagged, not frightened in his movements, but cautious. He felt a flush of shame at her command and began to move faster. Then, like a runner preparing for a race, Nephis got down on one knee, inhaled deeply, and lunged forward. Sonny dove into the deep shadow cast by the wall of the labyrinth and followed, running as fast as he could. However, the distance between them kept growing. Suddenly, he remembered walking behind Nephis as they crossed the bridge to the academy. Was it his fate to always follow behind her? Changing Star's running speed was incredibly fast. She was practically flying through the air like an arrow let loose from a bow. One of her arms was stretched backward, holding the sword with its point to the ground. The other was cutting the air with each stride. It took the two scavengers a couple of seconds to realize what was happening after noticing her. By that time, she was almost upon them, with madness burning in their eyes and viscous saliva dripping from their mandibles. The monsters screeched and charged forward. Nephis did not slow down, as though planning to ram them with her body. Sonny's heart skipped a bit. 4 terrifying pincers shot through the air. At the last moment, Nephis fell backward, falling on her side. The inertia carried her forward, and she slid through the mud, passing between the scavengers. Then, she twisted her body and stopped herself by plunging the sword into the ground. A bit slower, and she would have been impaled by one of the scavengers' legs. Sonny shook his head. "Crazy! She's crazy!" By the time Changing Star got back to her feet, one of the scavengers had already turned around. However, Sonny couldn't see what was going on, as his sight was blocked by the bulky carapace creatures. He only heard the sound of chitons striking against steel. There was no time to worry about that anyway, since he had his own problems to solve. Due to the insane maneuver that Nephis had pulled off, the second scavenger lagged a little behind the first one. It was just about to turn around when Sonny finally got close enough to launch an attack. Silently cursing, he ran up a narrow protrusion on the coral wall and jumped, aiming to pierce the weak point at the scavenger's back from above. His shadow was already wrapped around the azure blade, but at the last moment, the scavenger suddenly moved, slightly turning its torso to the right. The blade missed the concave spot where the armor plates connected, and instead, hit one of them square in the center, sliding helplessly across adamantine chitin.
Shit!
Instead of killing the beast with one decisive blow, Sonny ended up dealing no damage at all. What's worse, he landed right on top of the scavenger, practically hugging it from behind. In the next moment, the scavenger shook its carapace, throwing the irritating human off. Sonny flew sideways and crashed into the labyrinth wall, feeling breath being knocked out of him. Suffocating and disoriented, he fell gracelessly into the mud.
Not good.
By some instinct, Sonny rolled to the side. Something tore past him and hit the wall, sending pieces of crimson coral flying through the air. Then he was lifted into the air and thrown backward. But by that time, however, he had already come to his senses. Twisting his body, Sonny managed to land on his feet and take a few steps back without falling. In the next second, his sword was in front of him, held in both hands just like Nephis had taught him. The scavenger was already charging at him with a menacing fire burning in its eyes. Sonny took a deep breath.
Repetition, experience.
The shadow flowed from the azure blade to his hand, then spread to his arm and shoulder, and then finally covered his whole body. Sonny instantly felt stronger, faster, and more resilient. But was it enough? No. To survive, he would also need some luck. One pincer flew at him from the right, the other from the left. There was no time to retreat or dodge sideways, so instead, Sonny did something that made every instinct in his body scream in protest. He jumped forward, closing the distance to the charging monster. The pincers clashed together with a loud clack behind his back. Instinct or not, it was the only logical step. After all, the attack range of his sword was much shorter than that of the scavenger. He could only fight back by getting close. Before the beast had time to react, Sonny did what he had recently done thousands of times. His muscles moved even before his mind gave the command. With one fluid motion, he raised the sword over his head and slashed downward, pushing with one hand while pulling with the other. His whole body moved in concert to deliver a powerful blow. The azure blade whistled as it cut the air. Then, it hit the joint of one of the scavenger's front legs and cleaved right through it, severing the limb entirely. Blue blood sprayed everywhere. Sonny had less than a second to be amazed.
I actually did it?
But there was no time to be distracted. Due to the loss of its front leg, the scavenger lost balance for a moment, careening forward and down. However, he had 7 other legs. This wasn't going to last long. Coincidentally, though, at this exact moment, his other front leg slid into the mud, bringing the monster even further down. Sonny did not waste this chance. Taking a step forward, he thrust the azure blade up, pushing it into the scavenger's mouth. A severed mandible fell to the ground as the monster impaled itself on the sword with its weight. The massive body of the creature convulsed before falling still. It was dead. Sonny slowly exhaled, only now feeling the pain in his chest and at the back of his head. He carefully touched it and grimaced. His hand came back with wet blood. The familiar voice of the nightmare spell blared in Sonny's mind.
You have slain an awakened beast, Carapace Scavenger. Your shadow grows stronger. You have...
With no time to listen to the spell, Sonny tugged on the sword to dislodge it from the monster's head and hurried to help Nephis. The other scavenger was lying in the mud, clearly dead. His limbs were still twitching, indicating that the fatal blow was delivered just moments ago. It seemed like Nephis had managed to sever its spine by piercing the weak spot at the base of the beast's torso with her longsword. He couldn't see the silver-haired girl behind the bulky carcass. As Sonny approached it, he heard the sound of rugged, strained breathing. Then a shaky voice came from behind the scavenger. Very level. Don't come any closer. In the deathly silence of the battle's aftermath, Changing Star's voice sounded strange and subdued. Sonny suddenly felt as though someone had squeezed his heart in a fist. Steeling himself, he took another step forward. Nephis was standing in front of the dead scavenger, trying to catch her breath after the intense fight. There was a bloody gash on her shoulder. However, it didn't look life-threatening. Sunny's attention, though, was instantly drawn to something else. It seemed that at some point during the fight, the tall girl's makeshift seaweed top came apart, leaving her naked above the waist. She was covering her chest with one arm. Sunny flinched as though someone had stung him and hurriedly turned around. His face was burning. Without thinking about it, he even made his shadow look away. An awkward silence followed. After some time, Sunny forced himself to speak.
Are you all right?
Nephis was slow to answer. Yes. Sunny felt the blush creep into his cheeks.
Good. Good. I'll go fetch Cassia then.
Feeling as though an army of monsters was chasing him, he walked forward on stiff legs and then quickened his step, barely holding himself from running. Trying to get the vivid image out of his head, Sunny hurried to the place where Cassia was waiting for them. By the time they returned, Nephis had already fixed her top and was wearing it as though nothing had happened. However, Sunny couldn't help but feel that the look she gave him was somewhat weird. Nephis approached Sunny and nodded to the cut on his head. Let me check on that. She gave it a quick once-over. It's just a bleeder, nothing serious. Tell me if you feel dizzy and nauseous or have a strong headache, though. Since Sunny had none of these symptoms, he kept quiet. Nephis looked down at his clothes and sighed. Memory? He opened his mouth to say no, but then fell silent. Come to think of it, when he killed the scavenger, the spell did say something else after informing him about the absorbed shadow fragments. At the time, he was too busy to pay it any attention.
Let me check.
He summoned the runes and quickly found the cluster representing his memories. He saw the silver bell, puppeteer's shroud, and azure blade. If there was nothing new, what had the spell been on about? Suddenly, he noticed a new set of runes in the neighboring cluster. His eyes widened. He'd earned his first echo. He felt a rush of excitement as he wondered what this new development might bring. Sunny stood in the midst of the massive seaside labyrinth with two felled carapace scavengers splayed out on the sand. He'd just undergone his most vicious battle since the first nightmare. But he survived, and now it was his time to be rewarded. He summoned his runes to see what the nightmare spell had bestowed on him, and was floored to see he'd now acquired an echo. Sunny couldn't believe his eyes, but the runes read clear as day. Echo, Carapace Scavenger. Echoes were an extremely rare type of reward that Awakened could receive after slaying nightmare creatures. Many Awakened mowed through mountains of nightmare creatures without ever acquiring an echo. In many ways, echoes were similar to memories, but because they were so much harder to find, they were considered precious. In the real world, an echo could be sold for an unimaginable sum of money, likely more than Sunny had ever seen in his life. Without delaying it much further, he dove into his sea of soul. There, very few things had changed. A lonely black sun was still hanging over the calm, silent waters. It was orbited by spheres of light that represented his memories. This time, there were 3 of them. Just like before, Sunny couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was stealthily moving just beyond the periphery of his vision. However, Sunny was far too preoccupied with his echo to focus on that now. He wondered how it would manifest in this plane. Sunny stared up and noticed a large sphere of light hovering in the Shadow Core's orbit. It seemed to thrum with energy, vibrating as if it were alive. This orb was bigger than the memories, and Sunny felt himself instinctively reach out to it. The orb began to descend. The sphere slowly floated down and touched the dark water. As Sunny came closer, walking on the surface of the sea, its radiance slowly faded away, revealing the monster contained within. A hulking, menacing carapace scavenger was calmly standing in front of him. There was no madness in its eyes, or any feeling at all for that matter. After all, it wasn't really alive. It was just an echo. Shining runes appeared in the air around the scavenger. Sunny's eyes flit over the runes, taking in all he could about the echo. The runes read, Echo, Carapace Scavenger, Echo Type, Beast, Echo Core, Awakened, Echo Attributes, Strong, and Armored. Sunny bounced on his heels, trying to contain his excitement. He didn't know the exact details of what those attributes entailed, but they certainly sounded good. After all, if you're in the middle of a battle, it can't hurt to have something strong and armored on your side. Sunny read the last line of runes. Echo Description, a cursed soldier of the Fallen Legion. Before Sunny knew it, a wide grin appeared on his face. That scavenger was now his. It could be summoned and used to fight against his enemies, carry heavy cargo, or perform other tasks. What's more, it was a whole rank above its master, which meant that it was much stronger, more resilient, and fearsome than a dreamer with a dormant core should normally possess. With this echo by their side, many things would become easier. Following an impulse, Sunny raised a hand and brushed it against cold, black chitin. He just wanted to touch his new possession. However, the moment his palm touched the scavenger, a strange thing happened. The Sea of Soul suddenly surged a little, and a new set of runes appeared. Transform Echo into a shadow. Sunny flinched and snatched his hand back.
What the hell is that about?
He had never heard anything about transforming echoes into something else, let alone shadows. Then again, he had never heard about shadow cores and fragments, too. Sunny blinked.
It seems my aspect holds more secrets than I thought.
Sunny was curious about what this transformation might entail. He was very pleased with the echo already, but what if it could get even better? What if he had the potential to make his echo stronger or more versatile, and he avoided it out of fear? There was obviously some risk involved. He didn't know when he'd get another echo. If he'd get another echo. If this transformation squandered it, Sunny would never forgive himself. Sunny licked his lips and hesitated. Everything about his journey had been so different for him. He was a child of shadow, after all. He had to know what this meant.
Yes, transform it.
Sunny braced himself, but nothing happened. A moment later, the runes changed. Not enough shadow fragments to perform a transformation. Shadow fragments required, 100. Current shadow fragments, 24. He frowned, disappointed.
I see. So there is another use for the fragments. They can either enhance my own core or do something weird to echoes. How do I know which use is more beneficial without knowing what a transformation actually does?
Sunny reminded himself not to get too disappointed. This echo was plenty useful by itself. Sunny felt that it would be wiser to concentrate on strengthening himself, at least for now. Sunny sighed.
I'll experiment with it later.
The teen closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He felt himself exiting the Sea of Soul. Nephis and Cassia stood nearby, watching Sunny. When he zoned out, they had assumed he'd gone to the Sea of Soul to check his stats post-battle. But given how long he was taking, Nephis knew there had to be a development. As his eyes fluttered open, her inquisitive gaze was on him. Well? Sunny grinned.
I got an echo!
Nephis's pupils slightly widened, and she clenched her jaw in silence. Cassia, on the other hand, was more expressive.
An echo? You actually got an echo?
Sunny beamed proudly.
Yes!
Since the larger group of monsters was now minutes away from catching up with them, Sunny didn't waste any time and summoned the scavenger. The hulking beast immediately appeared in front of him, seemingly sewn together from tiny sparks of light. Soon, its black chitin became fully corporeal. Following Sunny's command, it shifted a little and raised its mighty pincers. Nephis observed the echo with an unreadable expression. Then, a corner of her lip slightly curled up. Good. Sunny looked at her with a smile.
I think we can task it with carrying Cassia. Outside of battle, it will help us the most.
The blind girl's mouth fell open.
Carry me? Like a mount?
He chuckled and slapped the scavenger on its carapace.
This bad boy can fit a petite girl like you with no problem at all. Trust me. I've been clambering these things a lot for the past few days. It's actually quite spacious on top of them, especially if they're not trying to kill you.
Cassia hesitated.
Well, okay. If you think it's for the best.
Sunny and Nephis helped the blind girl to climb on top of the Echo. Then, they used the golden rope to create makeshift reins for Cassia to hold on to. After quickly retrieving soul shards from the dead scavengers, the sleepers hastily left the passage, narrowly avoiding another battle. With Cassia riding comfortably atop the scavenger, their overall speed dramatically increased. Sunny and Nephis were jogging in the front, hoping to recoup the time lost in the first half of the day and reach the high point with an hour or two to spare. From time to time, they had to take detours to avoid fighting groups of carapace monsters. However, with a monster of their own by their side, the mood and mental state of the three sleepers were much better. For the first time since coming to this place, Sunny felt somewhat calm. Of course, this calmness didn't last long. At some point, he noticed that the wind had picked up a bit. Almost simultaneously, Cassia asked them to stop. Nephis looked at her with deep frowns. "What is it?" The blind girl let go of the reins.
Do you hear anything?
Sunny and Nephis looked at each other and then shook their heads. "No. Why?" Cassia scowled.
Help me get off this thing.
After they helped her, she stood motionless for a while, listening. Her scowl deepened. Then the blind girl cautiously kneeled and put her ear to the ground. Fear grew in Nephis's voice. "What do you hear?" Cassia licked her lips.
It's murmuring.
Suddenly, a drop of water fell on Sunny's face. He raised his head and looked at the sky. There, dark stormy clouds were gathering with unnatural speed. Pretty soon, they were bound to cover it completely. Sunny realized it was only a matter of time until the sun was blotted out entirely. And when that happened, his stomach turned with the realization this was bad. Very, very bad.
We need to move, now!
As Nephis turned to him, Sunny grabbed Cassia and helped her stand up. His face was even paler than usual, and there was a panicked look in his eyes.
Now, help me get her back on the scavenger.
The silver-haired girl raised her head and looked at the sky. Soon her expression darkened. Without saying anything, she did as he had asked. Cassia seemed a bit disoriented. She grabbed the reins and helplessly turned to her friend.
Neph, what's going on?
Changing Star glanced at her. When she eventually spoke, her voice sounded heavy. A storm is coming. Meanwhile, Sunny sent his shadow to climb on top of a tall pillar of coral and look ahead, trying to understand how far the cliffs they were aiming for were. From the look of it, there was still a considerable distance to go. However, the giant statue was already much further away. Going back now would be suicide. He turned to Nephis.
We're about 3 miles away from the cliffs. Do you think we can make it?
She scowled. If we take the most direct route, maybe. Sunny hesitated, then asked, What about the monsters? Changing Star looked ahead and gritted her teeth. We'll have to cut through.
That's it? That's the plan?
As he was fruitlessly trying to come up with some devious trick to save them, Nephis turned her head and glanced at him, puzzled. What are you waiting for? Run! As they darted forward, heavy drops of rain were starting to fall on the ground. Strong winds were howling between the coral blades, sending bits of mud and seaweed flying. With storm clouds gathering in the sky, sunlight dimmed, and a cold twilight descended upon the labyrinth. Sunny was running with all his might. He was leading their small group, choosing the straightest path toward the cliffs with the help of his shadow. Nephis was a step behind him. The scavenger carrying Cassia stomped through the mud with its 8 legs in the back. Without the need to avoid monsters and death breathing down their necks, they moved with amazing speed. Side passages and crimson walls were flashing past them in a blur. There was no need to hold back and conserve strength for the long run. If they were late to reach the cliffs by a minute, they were dead. They had to give it their all. Sonny was ready to fight a series of bloody skirmishes all along the way, but to his surprise, the inhabitants of the labyrinth did not give them much trouble. The scavengers seemed to be as panicked as they were. The bulky beasts were busy trying to hide inside the coral mounds or burrowing underground. On the rare occasions when one of them showed aggression, a quick slash of the sword or a threatening clack of a pincer was enough to make the monster change its mind. However, no matter how fast they ran, the storm was faster. The rain quickly turned into a pelting downpour, each drop becoming a torrent. The winds grew stronger, whipping against their bodies with enough force to make them stumble. The light dimmed even further. The sky was almost as black as night. Finally, a blinding bolt of lightning tore through the darkness. In the next moment, the ground under Sonny's feet trembled. He tumbled to the ground, rolling into the mud. He tried to stand up, but slipped and fell again. Someone's arm grabbed him by the shoulder and helped him rise. In the darkness of the storm, Sonny saw Changing Star's face. She opened her mouth and shouted, "Don't stop, run." He almost couldn't hear her behind the roaring wind and rain. By the time Sonny began to move, the dark, salty water was already as high as his shins. He gritted his teeth. The sea was coming back. He couldn't determine where the water was coming from, but with each minute it was rising higher. Soon it was up to his knee, then up to his waist, making running almost impossible. The speed of the group slowed down considerably. It was then, in a sudden flash of lightning, that they saw a dark mass of stone ahead. They had to make it to the cliffs. Almost at the same time, a terrible rumbling sound came from the depths of the labyrinth. Turning back, Sonny saw a colossal, crushing torrent of black water rushing through the crimson forest. Some distance away, a tardy scavenger was caught by it and thrown against the coral walls. The unbreakable carapace of the mighty creature cracked and burst open like a rotten egg. "Shit!" He turned to Nephis. "Time's up. Start climbing." She caught him by the arm. "Dismiss your echo." Sonny didn't know whether the scavenger could scale the cliff. In any case, Cassia wouldn't have been able to hold on if it did. He helped the blind girl get down and then sent the monster back to the Sea of Soul. Nephis lowered herself to let Cassia climb on her back, then tied them together with the golden rope. Not wasting any time, she gritted her teeth and stepped forward to grab onto the wet rocks of the cliff wall. They began the ascent, rushing to get as high as possible before the black torrent hit. After a few tense moments of climbing, Sonny screamed, "Brace!" In the next moment, a wall of dark water hit the rocks mere meters beneath their feet. As Sonny held for dear life, the whole cliff shuddered. A few boulders fell from somewhere high above, missing his head by mere inches. Somehow, all three of them were still alive. However, things were far from being over. The black water was still rising, now with frightening speed, threatening to swallow them at any second. They had to keep climbing, and they had to be faster than the surging sea. Sonny cursed as he searched for the next hold to grab onto. To survive, he had to scale the face of the cliff at an impossible speed. However, hastily climbing wet rocks was a recipe for disaster. One slip of a hand, and he would plunge towards the labyrinth below, surely to be crushed against the cliffs, drowned, or eaten by some giant monster. The torrential rain and hurricane wind made everything worse, but he had no choice. He frantically climbed, tearing his skin on sharp rocks. Every muscle in his body was in agony. Sonny would have been long dead if not for the shadow wrapped tightly around his body. But even with its help, the surging dark water was getting closer and closer. Damn it all! No matter how hard Sonny tried, he couldn't win back any distance. Soon, the water was at his feet. The sea slowly swallowed his legs, then his torso. He kept climbing, now fighting against the weight of the water and the force of the tide that was trying to tear him away from the cliff. But it was useless in the end. When the water covered his shoulders, he felt his fingers slipping from the wet rock. Sonny tried to hold on, but the current was too strong. He was pushed away like a weightless toy, losing any purchase. No! In the last second, a golden rope fell into the water beside him. Shaken, Sonny grabbed onto it. and held it with all his strength. The rope drew tight and lifted him out of the water. His feet touched the cliff wall again. Not wasting any time, he resumed climbing with the help of the rope. Finally, a strong hand grabbed him from above and dragged his body over the edge of the cliff. Sonny fell to the ground, struggling to breathe. After some time, he looked at Nephis, who was laying in a similar position to his right, equally as drained. She was still clutching the golden rope in her hand. Cassia was sitting a few steps away from them. He wanted to laugh, but had no strength for it. They survived. For a few precious minutes, Sonny simply lay on the ground, letting the rain hit his face. From time to time, a bolt of lightning arced through the skies, drowning everything in blinding light. But aside from those brief flashes, it was almost completely dark. If not for his attribute, he would have had trouble discerning the shapes of Nephis and Cassia, who rested nearby. He had to admit, the sound of the storm and sea was strangely calming now that he was out of immediate danger. He also enjoyed it. After a few moments of rest, a feeling of uneasiness entered Sonny's mind. Something felt off. Sonny scowled, trying to understand where that feeling was coming from. Finally, he realized that it was his shadow. It was trying to draw his attention to something.
Please, let me rest. I just want to rest.
He was too tired to do anything. Both his body and mind were exhausted. However, the shadow was very persistent. There was no way he could rest with that mental tug it was giving him. It was persistent. Dread crept into Sonny's chest. Sonny moaned and rolled over on his stomach, then slowly stood up. Nephis turned towards him. "What is it?" He frowned.
I don't know yet. Something feels off.
"What do you mean, feels off?" Sonny bit his lip.
It's my shadow. I think it saw something.
Cassia shivered and inched closer to Neph. Following his shadow's warning, Sonny looked around, trying to find any sign of danger in their surroundings. Even with his vision, he couldn't see anything out of place. The upper part of the cliffs was well above the stormy sea, forming a small island. Its surface was rugged and uneven, with several protruding ridges breaking the line of sight. There was a large space between their group and the nearest ridge. That space was littered with piles of dirt and tall boulders. Nephis stood up and summoned her sword, the steel flashing in the lightning. "Do you see anything?" Sonny squinted into the distance.
Not really.
At that moment, another lightning flash briefly illuminated the small island. His eyes widened. The tall boulders surrounding them were massive and irregularly shaped. They were black in color and motionless. That's why Sonny had not recognized them for what they were at first glance. All around them, scavengers were silently laying on the ground. Most were silent, but he saw one shift.
Shit.
Sonny froze, suddenly consumed by terror. The hair on the back of his neck bristled and stood up on end. 1, 2, 3, he lost count because of panic and gritted his teeth. 7, no, 8 of them. It seemed the 3 humans were not the only ones who thought of taking shelter from the dark sea on these cliffs. He trembled. These cliffs were a death trap. Noticing something on his face, Nephis tensed. "Sonny?" He slowly turned his head to her.
Don't speak. Don't move. Just stay where you are.
She followed his instructions without asking for the reason. However, a silent question appeared on her face. Cassia did the same. Sonny closed his eyes and breathed in, trying to calm his panicking mind and speeding pulse. There were no hopeless situations. Every problem had a solution. He just had to think of one. The scavengers did not attack yet,
Maybe they were asleep or patiently waiting out the storm, trying not to move in fear of attracting more terrifying monsters. Maybe they simply did not notice the humans. He had no idea how well these creatures could see. Were they able to see in the dark? Probably not, or at least not as well as he could. They stayed silent, though he wondered if they could hear them over the churning waters and roaring thunder. There was still hope. Sonny opened his eyes and looked at the small island again, but this time his perspective was different. He saw the deep darkness, the clamor of the storm that drowned out most of the sounds, and the large distance between the scavengers. This was his territory. It was perfectly suited for a murderous shadow. He rolled his shoulders and stood tall, looking out over the landscape before him. Didn't he dream of becoming a silent assassin? Well, here was his chance. He just had to execute each step perfectly, crawl through the darkness, strike without alerting the enemy, and kill each of them with one precise blow. Rinse and repeat. He already knew their strengths and weaknesses. All that was left was to put that knowledge to the test. And even if he makes a mistake, there were other means to fall back onto. The Echo and Nephis could do their part if he were to land himself in danger. Yes, that could work. It had to. Sonny looked at Changing Star and Cassia. "I'll take care of this." Nephis blanched. What? What are you doing?" Sonny held his finger to his lips, quieting her. Then he stepped closer to the cliff edge and seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Under the cover of darkness, Sonny crept forward. His steps were soft and measured, his breathing controlled. He quickly determined the optimal order of attack to minimize the chance of being discovered and proceeded to the first target, a hulking scavenger that was the furthest away from the pack. Hidden in the shadows, Sonny suddenly felt calm and focused. He felt as though he was finally in his natural element. As the looming silhouette of the scavenger approached, he slowed down and circled around his target. The monster did not move, oblivious to the lurking threat that was drawing closer with each second. Sonny held his breath and prepared to attack. He only had one chance. Do it right. With that thought, he silently lunged forward. One step, two. Sonny jumped and easily landed on the monster's carapace. The azure blade was already in his hand, its steel dark. A moment later, it plunged into the weak point on the scavenger's back, piercing the chitin and destroying its brain. The quiet crack of the breaking carapace was quickly washed away by the rain. It was done. Sonny felt a sense of triumph appear in his heart and quickly suppressed it. This wasn't the right time to celebrate. The scavenger was dead. However, 7 targets were still waiting for him in the darkness. While circling the target, he was focused on staying unnoticed and not alerting the enemy to his presence before reaching the optimal position for an attack. Why was the spell silent? He only saw the monster's back. His kill. That's why he didn't notice the terrible wounds that ran from the top of the creature's torso to its segmented leg, turned around and looked by the scavenger. At first he was afraid that the beast was still alive. Carapace had been cut open like a tin can. It was as dead as could be. Flesh and mangled organs could be easily seen through the large gaps, something that he had missed for blood. And blood he streamed down its body, only to be washed away by the storm. Sonny gulped. He might have felt awkward about performing a perfect ambush on a long-dead monster, but he was overwhelmed with fear of whatever had killed it in the first place. Looking around, he hesitated and summoned the azure blade back, then wrapped himself in the shadow. The small island was silent, except for the howling of the wind. The rain was still falling, forming a constant veil that hid away all details and distant objects. A rare flash of lightning sometimes flooded this bleak world with stark whiteness. Then, a thunderclap would come, making the skies tremble. With cold fright settling deep into his bones, Sonny cautiously moved to the next scavenger. He could tell from some distance that it was also dead, but he inched closer to make sure. Indeed, he was right. The creature was severed almost completely in half by the unknown assailant. Its wet innards were laying on the ground in a messy pile.
The darkness had long ago stopped being comforting, instead growing increasingly terrifying and oppressive. Sonny shivered. By the time he checked on all 8 monsters and confirmed that they were all dead, he was nauseous and scared out of his wits. When Sonny first realized that the black shapes were in fact scavengers, he thought that the situation was as bad as it could get. Now, he wasn't so sure. He was pretty convinced that things had gone from bad to worse. Standing near the last scavenger, Sonny observed his surroundings and thought about returning to Neff and Cassia. Maybe the terrifying killer had already left the island. They could just hide and hope for the best. He wouldn't be alone at least. However, not knowing what kind of danger was hiding in the darkness would drive him insane long before the morning came. Plus, with his fated attribute, hoping for the best was a fool's errand. That's why, although his body was covered in cold sweat, Sonny gritted his teeth and slowly walked toward the ridge that was obscuring the rest of the island from him. Coming close, he started climbing, trying to be as quiet as possible. The ridge wasn't very high, so he was able to scale it without much effort. Sticking close to the rocks, he raised his head and looked down. Then, he immediately wanted to let go and fall to the ground. Right beneath him, just a few meters away, a dark silhouette was outlined against the rocks. It was much larger than the scavengers, with jagged spikes growing out of its thick carapace. Its chitin was black and crimson, like an ancient armor splattered with fresh blood. Instead of pincers, 2 terrifying bone scythes were protruding from the joints of its arms. Each one was long and sharp enough to split a scavenger in 2. Sonny froze, afraid to move. He even stopped breathing. So, that's the killer. It was one of those monsters that they had seen retrieving the transcendent soul shards from the giant shark's carcass, or another of their kind. He remembered how the 2 creatures had cut through the horde of scavengers, killing or throwing aside any beast that got in their way. Slaughtering just 7 of them would not pose a problem for something that deadly. Not to mention getting rid of 3 sleepers. Careful not to make a sound, Sonny slowly lowered himself down. His whole body was trembling. Moving his arms and legs with utmost precision, he began climbing down from the ridge, praying not to be heard, sensed, or noticed in some other way. Luckily, the monster remained oblivious to his presence. Reaching the ground, Sonny took a few steps back, still facing the ridge. He had to force himself to turn around, feeling as though his back was being pierced by invisible needles. The young man stealthily moved in the direction where he had left his companions. A couple of minutes later, he returned to Nephis and Cassia. The girls were tense and nervous, waiting for his return in the darkness. Before coming out of the shadows, Sonny let them know that he was approaching.
It's me.
Nephis moved, lowering her sword a little. Her mouth was set in a grim line. "What's the situation?" she said, careful to keep her voice low. Sonny slowly exhaled, finally feeling a bit safer. For the first time, he was genuinely happy not to be alone in this cursed place.
There are 8 scavengers around us, but they're all dead. The killer is one of those big monsters we saw, the thing with the crimson pattern on its carapace, and scythes instead of pincers. It's hiding from the storm beneath a stone ridge not far from here.
A bolt of lightning flashed, illuminating everything around. In its aftermath, it looked as though 2 white sparks ignited in Changing Star's eyes. Soon, the reflection was gone, leaving them gray and inscrutable again. She tilted her head and whispered, as though talking to herself, "An awakened monster." Sonny licked his lips.
Yeah, so what should we do?
Nephis thought for a while, leaning on her sword. Then she looked at him and said, "Kill it." Sonny stared at her, lost for words. Finally, he collected himself and said the first thing that came to his mind.
Are you nuts?
The idea of fighting that thing was pretty ridiculous, if not completely insane. Realizing that his words might have sounded a bit rude, he cleared his throat and added,
I mean, have you thought this through? How are we supposed to kill that monstrosity?
Nephis took a deep breath, her steadiness a bit unnerving. It's not a question of thinking things through. We simply have no choice. She glanced at Cassia, who was listening to them. Her face had gone completely white with fear. Nephis pressed on and explained, "We can't leave the cliffs before morning, and neither can the monster. However, once the sun rises, it will easily see us and attack us. Then our only advantage, the element of surprise, will be gone. If we have to fight it anyway, it's better to be the ones initiating the fight." Changing Star looked around and added, "It's not completely dark yet, although barely. I can still see. Once the night comes, this won't be the case, so we will have to attack it first, and do it soon." Sonny shook his head. "This still doesn't explain how we are going to kill it. That thing just dispatched 8 scavengers like it was nothing. We are not its opponents. We don't even know its weaknesses." Nephis frowned. After a short pause, she said, "It's just an awakened monster." Sonny couldn't help but stare at her in disbelief. "What do you mean, just? An awakened monster? Have you forgotten that all 3 of us are only sleepers? Dormant humans are not supposed to be able to deal with awakened beasts, let alone monsters. The fact that we can reliably kill scavengers is already abnormal." She looked back at him, undisturbed, and simply answered, "But we are abnormal." Sonny stood there with his mouth open, not knowing what to say. Nephis sighed. "You and I are both not exactly ordinary sleepers, are we? Don't try and deny it. Someone ordinary simply would not have survived in this place." He frowned, not happy about her line of thought. Meanwhile, Changing Star continued. "You, me, plus the awakened beast you have as an echo, plus the advantage of a surprise attack. I'm not saying that it will be easy. We might die, but there's a good chance that we won't." She looked down at the silvery blade of her sword and added after a couple of seconds, "In any case, as I have already said, we don't have a choice." Sonny gritted his teeth, trying to find a logical retort. However, her reasoning seemed unassailable. He just had a really bad feeling about fighting that monster. In the tense silence, Cassia, who had been quiet all this time, suddenly spoke. "You are forgetting about the main advantage we have over that thing." Both of them looked at her surprised. The blind girl turned to face them and slightly lifted her head. "We are intelligent, and that monster is not." Her words echoed in the darkness. Sonny sighed. It seemed that a fight with the Bone Scythe monster was inevitable. Moments later, he was standing in the darkness, looking at the terrifying creature in front of him. His expression was grim and somber. Tightly gripping the azure blade, Sonny slowly inhaled. The ominous feeling he had before was still there, now stronger than ever. "I don't like this." With this thought, he exhaled and raised his sword. Monsters did possess some rudimentary intelligence. However, they could not compare to humans. At their core, they were still predators who acted mostly on instinct. Their cunning was beastly in nature and was not that hard to overcome. That gave the 3 sleepers a chance to leverage their advantage. After finalizing the plan, they started making their preparations. While Changing Star was getting ready, Sonny had retrieved the soul shards from the 8 dead scavengers. After delivering them to the silver-haired girl, he watched as she brought them to her chest and crushed them in her fist, one after another, absorbing the essence of each shard into her soul core. After a few minutes, when the changes caused by the absorption were over, Nephis opened her eyes and slowly inhaled. To a sleeper, consuming the shards of 8 awakened beasts was equivalent to slaying 16 dormant creatures. While not tremendous, it was still a significant boost in physical ability. Her body had become stronger, faster, and enhanced in every way. They were going to need every bit of that strength to survive. Because of how attuned Nephis was to her physicality, getting accustomed to her new limits did not take long. Very soon, she looked at Sunny and asked, "Are you ready?" Sunny sighed and glanced at his shadow, hoping for some moral support. The shadow pretended not to notice and ignored him. "Disloyal bastard." He shook his head, sighing, "As ready as I'll ever be." Nephis nodded and turned to Cassia. There was nothing really to say. They had already discussed everything there was to discuss, and empty words could not make the blind girl worry any less. Come to think of it, Sunny wouldn't have wanted to trade places with her, even though out of the three of them, she was the only one who didn't have to risk her life in combat. Facing the enemy, no matter how terrifying, was better than waiting powerlessly for the outcome, knowing that there's nothing you can do to change it. From that point of view, he was the lucky one. Cassia tried to put on a brave face. She turned to Nephis and forced a smile.
"Go and kill that thing. Maybe you'll finally get something decent to wear and stop making me feel so guilty."
A corner of Changing Star's lip curled up. "Okay." After that, she turned to Sunny and returned to her usual serious self. "Let's go." A few minutes later, he was standing on top of the rocky ridge, looking down at the deadly monster. The shadow was wrapped around his body, enhancing Sunny's physical abilities. Their plan was pretty solid, and he stood tall. It had a good chance of working. However, he still couldn't get rid of the ominous feeling that this was not going to end well. Something feels wrong. With a sigh, Sunny raised his hand and summoned the silver bell. Then, he lightly shook it, causing the clear melodic ringing to resound amidst the storm. Immediately, the monster below moved, turning its massive torso around and looking for the source of the sudden noise. As he saw Sunny, a mad crimson flame ignited in its eyes. However, Sunny did not see any of this, because he was already facing the other way. As soon as the bell rang, he turned around and jumped down from the ridge without a second of hesitation. The ridge wasn't very tall, but there was still a considerable distance to the ground. Ugh. Sunny hit the rocks hard and rolled, trying to disperse the force of the impact. As soon as he got back to his feet, he ran, trying to get as far away as possible. A moment later, the ridge exploded behind his back. The monster simply crushed into it with its hulking body, breaking through the layers of rocks as though they were paper. Simultaneously, there was a flash of lightning and a thunderclap, drowning the loud rumble of the falling debris. The creature locked onto retreating Sunny and lunged forward, trying to pierce his body with one of its sides. Shards of rock were flowing like a torrent from its spiked carapace. Luckily, Sunny was already far enough. Without slowing down, he lowered his body, ran for several more meters, and then turned around. The monster, who was more than 3 meters tall, rushed at him like a speeding train. The horrific image was enough to make any person falter. However, Sunny stood his ground, raising the azure blade above his head. He couldn't move. He refused to move. After all, he was the bait. Half a dozen meters away from him, the monster finally reached their trap. Almost unnoticeable in the darkness and the pouring rain, the golden rope was strung between 2 massive boulders at the height of the creature's leg joints. Earlier, Sunny had lowered his body to run beneath it. Overwhelmed by bloodlust, the monster did not notice the tautly drawn rope and ran into it at full speed. If it was a normal rope, it would, without a doubt, have immediately snapped. However, the golden rope was a memory, and being incredibly sturdy was one of its attributes. The rocks it was tied to, unfortunately, were quite mundane. They shattered almost immediately, but the damage was already done. With its front legs suddenly jerked backward, the Scythe Slayer lost its balance and crashed into the ground face first, sliding forward on wet stone and leaving behind a shallow trench. Sunny jumped away. The monster hardly skipped a beat. Almost immediately, two bone scythes pierced the ground, jerking its massive body to a stop. In the next moment, unexpectedly swift and nimble for its size, it was already beginning to rise. If it was allowed to stand up, their fates would be sealed. Fortunately, Sonny's echo was faster. The moment the monster fell, it stopped pretending to be one of the dead scavengers, got up, and dashed forward. Just as their enemy was about to rise, it jumped on its carapace from behind, pinning the creature down with its weight, and locked its pincers on the creature's arms just behind the point where the bone scythes began. Even though the echo was wounded by the spikes growing from the monster's carapace, it succeeded in immobilizing it for at least a second. But a second was just long enough. Nephis suddenly sprang up, appearing in front of the monster. She had been lying in wait, prepared for their ambush. Darting between its terrifying scythes, she leaned forward and delivered a devastating thrust with her longsword, putting her whole weight behind it. They didn't know if the awakened monster had the same weak spot on its back as its lesser relatives, the scavengers, had. However, there was no reason to assume that there was no gap between its carapace and torso armor. It was a mechanical issue. Anything that had to be flexible could not be too rigid. The tip of Changing Star's sword plunged into the narrow gap. Then, the sword disappeared into the monster's body, penetrating so deep that its hilt ended up brushing against the chitin.
Hell yes!
Sonny thought, triumphant. However, in the next second, his expression dimmed. Because the creature didn't even seem to notice the wound that was supposed to be, if not fatal, then at least heavily debilitating. It suddenly twisted, just barely straining its body. It threw the echo off its carapace and rose to its feet. Its bone scythes scraped against the rock as it pulled them out from the ground. Defenseless, Nephis was right in front of it, her sword still stuck in the monster's flesh. Oh no. Sonny was too far away to do anything. He circled the massive creature to attack it from behind. The echo was on the ground, still reeling from being thrown off the enemy's back. It didn't seem like it could help either. For the moment, Changing Star was on her own. The scythes pierced the air, aiming for her flesh. At the last moment, however, a pair of pincers locked one of them into an iron grip. That gave Nephis another fraction of a second to react. Letting go of the sword, she dove under the creature's body, hiding in the blind spot of the remaining scythe's attack range. As far as hiding places went, this one wasn't optimal, since all the monster had to do to crush her into a bloody pulp was to lie down. However, at that moment, Nephis had no other choice.
This is bad.
Sonny was already behind the creature, hoping to buy Neph some time. He brandished the azure blade and slashed it down. The sword connected with the joint of one of the monster's rear legs, drawing azure blood. However, unlike how it was in battle against a scavenger, he failed to completely sever the limb. It was too tough and thick. In the next moment, the leg disappeared from Sonny's field of vision. Crap! As that thought appeared in his mind, Sonny raised his head and looked at the monster. Somehow it had already turned around and was now facing him, two crimson flames burning with bloodlust in its eyes. Before Sonny could properly react, the sharp tip of a bone scythe hit him in the chest with the force of a siege ram. The only thing he managed to do was transfer the shadow from his body to the puppeteer's shroud. Because of this lightning-fast decision, the armor held. He wasn't pierced through the heart and impaled on the scythe. However, it was a small consolation. The force of the blow was still enough to make his ribcage cave in and send his body flying through the air like a rag doll. Somehow, Sonny found himself laying on the ground. His body felt weird and he couldn't breathe. Something bitter was flowing from his mouth, making him choke. It was blood. He was drowning in his own blood. Sonny tried to move weakly, but his limbs wouldn't listen to him. Only the shadow listened, enveloping his body and delaying the inevitable a little.
I'm hurt.
With his thoughts moving slower and slower, as though submerged in a dense fog, he looked up, hoping to see the stars. Instead, he saw two burning crimson eyes approaching him from the darkness. At that moment, hovering on the edge of consciousness, Sonny realized that he was about to die. He had to struggle against the fog that permeated his mind, slowing down his thoughts and dampening all emotions. All except for fear. Despite the fact that his body was broken and his mind was paralyzed, some stubborn part of Sonny was still refusing to give up. He wasn't ready to die, at least not without giving his all to survive. He was revolted by the thought of giving this world the satisfaction of a win over him. Hadn't he told Gregor that he was going to survive no matter what, despite them all? That's right. He might be a former, shameless liar, but a promise was still a promise. But how was he even supposed to survive? No matter how he looked at it, the situation seemed hopeless. As the scythe monster approached, its eyes shining menacingly with bloodthirsty crimson light, Sonny tried to pierce through the fog that enveloped his mind. However, his attempts were aimless and weak. It was hard to find purchase in the fog. He needed an anchor. Suddenly, a simple thought caught his attention. It was something that he had repeated 1,000 times, burning it into his mind. Repetition, experience, clarity. Clarity. He remembered what Nephis had taught him. The essence of combat was murder. Any action performed during a battle served only one of two purposes. It was either to kill your enemy or prevent the enemy from killing you. If he could learn that, he could have enough clarity to master the mind. Back then, he didn't understand the profound meaning behind the simple word, clarity, that Nephis had used. But now, with his mind in shambles, he was finally able to grasp it. The two truths behind the essence and purpose of combat were simple and solid, almost tangible. Even in his half-conscious state, he was able to use them as a stable foundation in the fog. Then, he reformed his mind around this foundation, building it along the stark lines of that truth. Suddenly, he was able to think again. What's more, his thoughts were clear and incredibly fast, free of all unnecessary distractions. This was clarity. Sonny looked up at the advancing monster, calmly weighing his options. His body was pretty much useless. He couldn't move his limbs at all. The shadow still followed his commands, but it was busy doing an important job, keeping him from dying immediately. Even with its help, he wouldn't be able to last long. But this was a useless thought. He couldn't do anything about it, so there was no sense in wasting time considering it further. With his body immobilized, memories couldn't be used. That only left the echo. The Carapace scavenger was going to have to be his only tool to either kill the enemy or prevent the enemy from killing him. The monster was quickly approaching Sonny. Its mandibles moved, viscous saliva flowing down from them in a torrent of transparent mucus. In a flash of lightning, he was able to see and instantly register every spike, every scratch, every abrasion on the creature's carapace. The handle of Changing Star's sword was still protruding from its body, washed in azure blood. What an ugly bastard! Sonny was being hypocritical. Truth be told, with its black carapace painted with crimson patterns and a mighty body specially designed for mayhem and slaughter, the Scythe Slayer looked strikingly and incredibly menacing. It was almost majestic, in a terrifying, murderous kind of way. Unable to move, he had to look helplessly as the monster closed the distance between them and loomed over Sonny's broken, bleeding body. Its scythes rose into the air, ready to strike down. Looking right into the monster's burning eyes, Sonny thought, "Go to hell, you overgrown bug!" The scythes shot toward his body. In the last moment, something massive and furious rammed into the monster from the side, throwing it away. It was Sunny's Echo, the carapace scavenger. Not bothering with its own safety anymore, the Echo entwined itself with the enemy in a chaotic mess of limbs as they rolled on the ground. Despite the fact that it was smaller and weaker, its crazy assault and complete disregard for its own life were enough to give the bigger monster some pause. The Echo lashed out with its pincers, ramming them against the creature's carapace in a crazy whirlwind of blows. For a moment, the howling of the wind was drowned out by the clamor of chitin striking against chitin. The Slayer's carapace mostly held, but a couple of cracks did appear on its black surface. However, the great beast was still superior to the scavenger in every way. Even with one of its sides pinned awkwardly under its body, the monster was more than able to repel the sudden attack. With an angry screech, it sliced with the other side, cutting one of the scavenger's pincer arms clean off. Then, it strained its legs and threw the smaller creature away. In the process, the rear leg that was already wounded by Sunny broke off, but the monster didn't pay it any attention. Burning with madness and fury, it untangled its limbs and slowly stood up. Another deafening screech resounded in the howling darkness of the storm, hurting Sunny's ears. Now what? He thought, momentarily lost for ideas. But then, something very unexpected happened. As the Slayer moved to finish off the Echo, it had to slightly raise and lean its torso back to account for the loss of a rear leg and keep its balance. At that moment, a bolt of lightning landed right in the middle of the small island. With how tall the monster was, the lightning was immediately attracted to the handle of the sword that was still sticking from its body, aimed at the sky at a slight angle. At that moment, Changing Star's longsword suddenly became a lightning rod. Instantly, hundreds of millions of volts of electricity coursed through the Slayer's body. In a blinding flash of light, it was thrown to the ground. Wisps of smoke rose from the cracks in its carapace. In a strange turn of events, arcs of residual electricity danced on the monster's chitin, slowly accumulating on the crimson patterns on it. Under that influence, the crimson pattern changed color, becoming white and incandescent. Sunny stared at all this in bewilderment. It's glowing? For a second, he hoped that the monster was dead. But no, a single strike of lightning was not enough to kill a creature like that. Just a few moments after being electrocuted, the Slayer moved, slightly shaking its body. Although it was in rather bad shape, it was still alive and full of murderous intent. Looking somewhat dazed, the monster gathered its limbs and tried to stand up. Slowly, but surely, it was coming back to its senses. The bone scythe scraped against the rocks, helping it rise. However, before it did, Nephis was suddenly right in front of it.
Ha!
Grabbing the hilt of the longsword, she grimaced as the heat burned her hands. Then, she twisted the blade, making the Slayer's body twitch, and pulled it out, breaking apart a large portion of its lower torso armor. The monster tried to slash at her with a scythe, but Changing Star was quicker. Dashing to the side, she simultaneously lashed out with her sword. The glowing white-hot blade caught the creature's arm right below the joint and cleaved through it, sending the terrifying bone scythe flying through the air in a rain of azure blood. The Slayer screeched and swatted her away with one of its legs. Nephis was thrown back and rolled on the rocks, losing her grip on the sword. Her eyes momentarily lost focus. The monster, on the contrary, was back to its senses. It seemed as though the sudden pain of losing a limb had shaken it wide awake. Raising to its full height, it opened its ugly mouth and let out a deafening, enraged shriek. Then it lunged toward Neph with all-consuming hatred burning in its eyes. But it didn't get far. Right as the livid monster was beginning its attack, the battered Echo appeared in its path. Its one remaining pincer shot forward, plunging into the wide gap in the armor created by Changing Star's sword. Twisting its arm, the scavenger pushed it inside the enemy's body, wreaking havoc on its innards. In the end, it even lifted the whole monster in the air a little, its pincer going in almost up to the shoulder. The slayer lashed out with its scythe, piercing the echo's chest through. Then, it twitched a couple of times and fell still. The scavenger screeched angrily and jerked its pincer, tearing the bigger monster's torso clean off its carapace. Proudly giving the eviscerated enemy one last look, it then staggered and collapsed to the ground. Sunny tiredly dismissed the echo, hoping that it would survive. Maybe it would heal in whatever nether realm he sent it to between calls. But Sunny wasn't feeling too well. He was pretty much done for.
You have slain an awakened monster, Carapace Centurion.
The spell's voice fell uselessly on his deaf ears. It sounded distorted and distant.
You have received a memory, Starlight Legion armor. Your shadow grows stronger.
I won.
Sunny closed his eyes, finally allowing pain and exhaustion to flood his mind. The fog was back, making everything feel like it was happening to someone else. He was tired, and he couldn't breathe. Drowning in blood was not very pleasant. As his consciousness began to slip, he heard the sound of someone's hurried steps, and then 2 soft hands gently touched his face. Somewhat surprised, Sunny struggled to open his eyes. As his vision slowly focused, he saw Nephis's pale face looming over him. Her short silver hair was wet, sticking close to her skin. She knelt beside his broken body, caressing his face with her hands. In her eyes, there was a strange expression. It was as though she was frightened, but resigned to something. Her pupils were wide and dark.
What?
Gritting her teeth, Nephis moved her hands to his collapsed chest and pressed them lightly against it, causing a pulse of pain to radiate through Sunny's body. Then a soft, radiant brilliance suddenly ignited beneath the skin of her palms, reflecting in her gray eyes like 2 dancing white sparks. Almost immediately, Changing Star's face contorted in a grimace of excruciating agony. Her skin became as white as a sheet of paper. As she bit her lower lip, drops of blood soon rolled to her chin. As the radiance grew in intensity, Nephis shut her eyes tightly, tears streaming down her tortured, bloodless face. Sunny, on the contrary, felt like he was in heaven. All pain disappeared from his body, replaced by a gentle, all-encompassing warmth. He felt as though he was being cleansed by something pure and sacred, by a white, pristine, purifying flame. Under the influence of the flame, his dying body began to repair itself. His shattered bones were reassembled from the shards. His torn flesh regenerated and became whole again. His collapsed lungs and damaged heart were brought back to life and rejuvenated, instantly turning strong and healthy. Suddenly, he could breathe again. As his chest moved, drawing in a new breath, Nephis flinched away with a harrowing moan. The white radiance beneath her skin dimmed and disappeared, letting the darkness return to its rightful place. Crawling away a few steps, Changing Star stopped, crawling on her hands and knees. Then, she violently vomited. Her whole body was shivering uncontrollably, as though she was about to have some kind of fit. As the shivers calmed, she slowly lowered herself to the ground and lay there, motionlessly, catching the raindrops with her mouth. Sunny, meanwhile, raised his hands and carefully explored his body. To his surprise, nothing hurt. It was as though he was never wounded in the first place,
let alone almost died. With the help of Nephis and her mysterious aspect ability, he was completely healed. It was a miracle. By the time the storm was over, it was already deep into the night. Sunny, Nephis, and Cassia huddled together for warmth and slept as though they were dead, too tired to make someone keep watch. If anything were to happen, the shadow would probably alarm them in advance. If not, so be it. They were just too exhausted to care. Luckily, the rest of the night went without incident. In the morning, no one was in a hurry to make any plans or suggest leaving the cliffs. They just gathered some meat from the dead Carapace Centurion and the scavengers, collected the 2 soul shards, and moved to the opposite side of the small island, afraid that the remains would attract some creature's attention. As it turned out, they were right. Not long after the group left the place of the battle, a dark spot appeared in the sky. Soon, it grew larger and approached the cliffs, landing near the corpse of the Centurion in a whirlwind. Sunny had never seen anything like it. The creature was massive in size, easily weighing twice as much as the Carapace monster. Its body was white as a corpse and muscular, like that of a lion. It had 2 mighty paws in the back and 6 in the front, protruding messily out of its wide chest. Each ended with long, sharp talons. The neck of the flying monstrosity was covered in long black feathers, as well as its enormous wings. Its head resembled that of a raven, with large round eyes and a terrifying black beak. While they hid behind rocks, the creature feasted on the dead Centurion, easily breaking its carapace apart with its talons and beak. Then, satisfied, it grabbed a few scavenger carcasses with its paws and rose back into the air, creating a small hurricane with each flap of its black wings. The creature left the cliffs and flew back the way it came. It was moving west. Following the black dot as it disappeared into the distance, Sunny sighed.
Neph, what do you think that thing is?
Nephis was also looking at the sky. After a few seconds, she lowered her gaze.
I have no idea.
Sunny simply nodded and went about his business. He still had to perform his 1,000 strikes. After making a fire, they roasted the Centurion's meat and had a delicious, hefty breakfast. Then, stuffed, the 3 of them lay down and lazily rested. After fighting against 2 scavengers at once, running away and barely surviving the sudden flood, climbing tall cliffs in the middle of a storm, and battling an awakened monster, all done in a single day, they deserved some time off. Plus, Sunny needed to sort himself out. Truth be told, he was feeling a bit strange. The reason for this was not his traumatic near-death experience, although it had a lot to do with it. The thing was that, after the unexpected epiphany he had while trying to fight against the deathly mind fog, Sunny felt as though he had been changed, because the clarity he gained never went away. It was still here, at the center of his being. He felt as though his very way of thinking and perceiving the world was now completely different. It was stark, streamlined, and dauntless. Sunny felt that his mind had become calmer. He was now able to think much faster and act without hesitation. Many things that previously seemed obscure and frightening suddenly became predictable and thus surmountable. It was as though he had discovered an underlying order to the world that wasn't there before. That inner understanding gave him an advantage that was hard to explain with words. In a sense, this change was even more profound than the transformation of his body at the end of the first nightmare. He felt that he had made a big leap in his combat ability and overall power, even though it wasn't tied to the number of consumed shadow fragments or unlocked aspect abilities. Looking at the sky, Sunny wondered if this was how Nephis always felt.
Probably. Mastery of the body, mastery of the mind, right?
He was still far away from being a master, but it felt as though he was on the right track. Sometime later, Sunny approached the western edge of the cliffs. Nephis was sitting there, her feet dangling over the edge. She was looking towards the setting sun in the west, lost in her thoughts. He sat down beside the silver-haired girl and followed her gaze, trying to guess what she was thinking about. Though he didn't expect to be even close in his guesses, Changing Star was as hard as ever to understand. Sonny shifted, feeling incredibly embarrassed. Finally, he gathered his courage and said, "You saved my life twice yesterday." Nephis glanced at him and turned away again. "I did." He hesitated, trying to find the correct words. In the end, he couldn't come up with anything and simply said, "Thank you." This time, she looked at him a bit longer. Her face was calm and indifferent. "There's no need to thank me. Without you and your shadow, we would have drowned before reaching the cliffs or been torn apart by a large group of scavengers after stumbling on them in the labyrinth." After that uncharacteristically long sentence, she fell silent. And after a while, speaking in a soft voice, she added, "We are allies." Sonny nodded, knowing that she was right. Still, Nephis went above and beyond to keep him alive. Even if he had also done his part, not everyone would have gone to such lengths to return the favor. But he remained silent, mostly because he couldn't even imagine how she would respond to such a thing. Between her relationship with Cassia and how she approached their alliance, she operated according to an honor code all her own. It was nothing like what the other students or Jet or his teachers had alluded to. Had he spoken, she would likely only continue to stare right at him. She would stay quiet for some time and then say something like, "I just wanted to," or "It is what it is," in a flat tone, and then there would be an awkward silence. With a subtle smile, Sonny looked away. A minute or two later, he said, "It's your flaw, isn't it? The pain you feel every time you use your ability." Nephis was silent for a while before answering. Then she simply said, "Yes." Sonny looked at her. Changing Star's profile was calm and distant. The wind was playing with her short silver hair. "What does it feel like?" She was staring into the distance. "Like burning alive." He sighed, trying to imagine what kind of suffering someone being burned alive would have to endure. As always, the spell was cruel. "I'm sorry," he said quietly after some time. Nephis shrugged, not turning her head. "It's just pain." Sonny looked away, trying to hide his expression. Just pain. These might have been the saddest words he had ever heard. When they returned to the makeshift camp, the first thing that Nephis did was come up to Cassia. "Hey, Cass, guess what?" The blind girl turned to her and smiled. "You've finally received an armor-type memory?" Simultaneously, Nephis said, "I found something decent to wear." Then she fell silent and stared at her smiling friend. Nephis was shocked. Cassia couldn't see her expression, but the stunned silence spoke volumes. Cassia laughed. "The sound of your footsteps changed." Changing Star blinked. "Ah, I see. Well, it's from the Carapace Centurion." While she was describing the armor to Cassia and letting her touch the mysterious white metal it was forged out of, Sonny relaxed and rested by the fire. A bit later, Nephis was busy preparing dinner. Sonny was once again laying lazily on the stones and staring into the sky. The sky had turned gray and unfriendly. With all three of them equipped with decent armor, they were finally starting to resemble a real awakened cohort. Sonny thought that their group was rather eye-catching, even by awakened standards. In her light tunic and sea-weave cloak, beautiful and delicate Cassia looked like an ethereal princess. Lithe and poised, Nephis was like a noble knight tasked with protecting her. Sonny, however, if he was generous to himself, he would say that he looked like a young squire. But truthfully, he resembled a page boy a lot more, at best. If a random stranger were to see the three of them, the stranger would most likely assume that Sonny was either a lowly servant or a feeble ruffian who had been captured by the noble lady's guard. Sonny groaned,
feeling himself sinking into old bitter thoughts. His self-esteem was always like this, though now he was starting to see some of his inner strength, even if it seemed very, very inferior.
Well, that'll just add to their surprise when I stab them in the back.
Sonny smiled to himself, but his expression faltered. Sure, he would have enemies, and they had found plenty in this world, but now he had allies. Why would he stab a random stranger? If anything, it would more likely be some kind of nightmarish monster. At that moment, Cassia sat down by his side. Sonny turned his head, looking at the blind girl with a bit of surprise. She bit her lip.
Nephis told me that you almost died yesterday.
Sonny shifted uncomfortably in his seat.
Oh, so that's what this is about.
He shrugged.
Yeah.
Then, with a silent sigh, Sonny added,
But don't worry about it too much. It's not my first brush with death.
Although it was, as far as he knew, the closest. The memory still sent shivers running down his spine. Cassia was silent for a while. Then she quietly said,
I'm sorry.
Sonny raised his eyebrows.
Sorry? What are you sorry for?
The blind girl lowered her eyes.
For being so useless.
Sonny frowned and looked away. A second or two later, he said in a soft, attemptedly casual tone,
You're not useless.
Cassia softly chuckled.
Aren't I? If I want to walk, I need to be leashed to you or Neph. If I want to eat, I need to wait for one of you to feed me. That's my life now. I can't do even the simplest of things without your help, let alone be of use to either of you in return.
Slowly, her voice turned raw with emotion. This was the first time Sonny had seen her mask of resolve slip a little, revealing the desperate, angry, frightened face beneath. He was silent for a long time. Then he said,
Hey, have I ever told you about my first nightmare?
The blind girl shook her head. Sonny half closed his eyes.
My first nightmare was as bad as it gets. To tell you the truth, the situation was pretty hopeless. I was a slave, destined to die of cold or mistreatment, chained, bleeding, defenseless. What's worse, my aspect turned out to be completely useless. I mean, literally. If I remember correctly, the phrase the spell had chosen to describe it was a useless wretch, with no skills or abilities worth a mention.
Cassia turned her head slightly, visibly drawn in by his words.
Then, how did you survive? Did things change for the better?
Sonny smiled bitterly.
Gods no, they quickly turned worse. Much, much worse. But then, in a strange twist of fate, my useless aspect turned out to be the only thing that could guide me through that mess alive. By some strange twist of fate, in that regard, I turned out to be incredibly lucky.
He shifted a little and glanced at the delicate girl, noticing a thoughtful frown on her face.
But here's the thing about luck. People usually speak about it as though luck is something that just happens to you. It's not. Luck is 50% circumstance and 50% your own ability to grasp it. Luck is something you have to make happen yourself. I fought with everything I had to survive. That's one of the 2 reasons I'm still here. It's one of the reasons I even managed to live long enough to end up in this circumstance.
Saying that, Sonny remembered the cold, dark mountain and shivered. Then, pushing the chilling memories away, he continued.
The second reason is the spell itself. I won't go as far as to call it reasonable, but it seems to attempt to operate on some level of fairness or some kind of balanced scale. I guess it's fair in its own perverted way. The spell takes with one hand and gives with the other. It was like this with my first nightmare. And it is the same with you.
Cassia's frown deepened. Sonny chose his next words very carefully. Eventually, he spoke.
Your flaw is one of the more extreme ones I have ever seen or heard of. You're right. Without help from someone like Neph, you would probably have been pretty fucked. And people like her, well, I honestly wasn't sure someone like her would have existed in here, but...
The blind girl gritted her teeth.
But what?
Sunny looked at her with a serious expression.
But that also means that the other side of the flaw, your power, is equally as extraordinary. You just haven't found the way to grasp it yet. When you do, believe me, you'll remember this conversation and maybe wonder why you didn't notice its potential before.
Cassia's expression changed to one of doubt and confusion.
Do you really think so?
She whispered. There was a hint of desperate desire in her voice. However, the question itself almost made him laugh, for an obvious reason.
Trust me, I'm the most honest person in the world. 2 worlds, in fact.
Sunny would love nothing more than to be less honest, but sadly, he was physically incapable of doing so. Of course, she didn't have to know that. Cassia was silent for a long time, lost in thought. It looked as though she was in the throes of some inner struggle. Sunny almost assumed that their conversation was over, but then she suddenly spoke in a low, raspy voice.
I had more visions than I told you guys about.
Sunny blinked, staring at the blind girl with surprise and a bit of apprehension. Her sudden statement really threw him off. Why would Cassia keep something like this secret? And why tell him now? Confused, he swallowed.
You've had more visions? Why haven't you told us?
A fleeting, tired smile appeared on Cassia's face. She lowered her head and remained silent for a while. Then she closed her eyes. Her voice was strained and somber.
You probably don't know. How could you? But knowledge can be really heavy. Sometimes it can be the heaviest thing in the world.
Then a sad smile appeared on her face.
I'm afraid that by telling you, I will actually cause the things I saw to come true.
Sunny tensed up, alarmed by the implication behind her words. If she was afraid of the visions coming true, then their content must have been pretty bad. Did that mean death? Injury? Maybe the end of the whole world? A tense silence hung between them as Sunny waited for her to elaborate. But the slow crackling of the nearby campfire was the only noise that filled the air. If something terrible was destined to befall them, Sunny had to know about it in advance. That way, he would be able to make preparations and deal with whatever happened. Preparation could make so many situations far less dire. However, what if his preparations would become the very reason for that terrible thing to happen, making Cassia's vision a self-fulfilling prophecy? This was the danger of knowing the future. Sunny grumbled to himself.
Damn it, my head hurts. I hate this crap.
Sunny struggled for a long time, trying to decide if he should pressure Cassia to reveal her visions. Either outcome was going to leave him uneasy, so he was really not sure what to do. In the end, unable to make a decision, Sunny simply remained silent. He wasn't sure what was going on in the girl's head. Likely, it was the same debate he was having with himself, but she must have come to a different conclusion because she eventually broke the silence.
Can you just promise me one thing?
It seemed as though this was her attempt to find a compromise between revealing everything and doing nothing. Sunny frowned.
That depends on what it is.
The blind girl hesitated before speaking.
Can you promise that you'll take care of Neff, no matter what?
Sunny found that a bizarre request. Neff was stronger and faster than him. She was a more skilled fighter than anyone in their class. Why would he need to take care of her? Was Cassia's disastrous vision about Nephis? Was something going to happen to her, or maybe she'd do something awful? Sunny shook his head in a vain attempt to clear away the questions and confusion. Nephis was nice, and he liked her, but at the end of the day, there was a simple premise that guided him through life.
I can't promise that. I can barely take care of myself.
Sonny also simply didn't trust Nephis enough to make a promise like that. He had nothing against Changing Star, and even liked her quite a bit. But they didn't really know each other. Their alliance was one of necessity, not choice. Who knew what would happen once their need for each other was no longer there? No matter what was too steep of a requirement. Of course, he could have misled Cassia by answering yes. After all, the question was whether or not he could make a promise, not whether or not he would follow through with it. But at that moment, Sonny was strangely reluctant to deceive the blind girl. Maybe that whole honesty thing was slowly growing on him. Cassia sighed and turned away. Suddenly, it felt like something imperceptible about her changed. There was a tinge of disappointment in her voice.
I see. Yeah, that's fair.
With that, she summoned her staff and walked away, leaving Sonny in a somber and uneasy mood, just like he had expected. No matter how much he tried to relax after that, his thoughts kept wandering. Eventually, Sonny found himself trying to find connections between various pieces of information about the Starless Void, or the Forgotten Shore, as it was called in the Azure Blade's description. If nothing else, it could distract him from thinking about the latter part of his conversation with Cassia. Also, for some reason, the need to understand their environment suddenly seemed much more vital. His sword, the Starlight Legion armor, the Carapace monsters, and the giant headless statue seemed to be connected in some way, but he couldn't quite understand how. Was the statue a monument to one of the 7 founders of the Starlight Legion? The line of runes describing the armor said that their names and faces were lost to time. The statue's missing head would certainly fit that description. The scavenger's echo suggested that the Carapace monsters were cursed soldiers of the Fallen Legion. Was that Fallen Legion the Starlight Legion? The fact that he had received the Starlight armor after slaying a Carapace Centurion was almost a certain confirmation of that theory. If so, why were they cursed? Starless Void, Starlight Legion. What did all of it mean? The 7 heroes were described as being born in the all-consuming darkness. Their oath was to return light to the cursed land. What light did they seek? Starlight? And what was the nature of the all-consuming darkness? Was it the manifestation of the curse that befell their land? And if so, was it the same curse that eventually turned soldiers of the Starlight Legion into Carapace monsters? If the curse was still around, was Sonny going to wake up one day with patches of chitin growing over his skin? Sonny squirmed at the thought, his skin crawling as he imagined what it might be like to become trapped as one of those monsters. What a terrifying fate. Sonny's instinct was to pull back, to drop all this speculating and worry about the real threats he was facing. But something deep inside told him the answers to his future may lay in the past. Understanding this place could be vital. He felt like he was on the precipice of a realization and returned to his analysis. The 7 heroes were forgotten, but the memory of their oath apparently still remained. On this forgotten shore only steel remembers. That was the Azure Blade's description. Was there a hidden meaning behind these words? Were the memories received on the forgotten shore hiding a secret? Sonny groaned. So many questions, and not a single answer. And then there was the main mystery, Cassia's vision, the one she chose to reveal to them. She dreamt of a boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Once the seals were broken, the darkness escaped. She also saw a crimson spire with 7 severed heads guarding 7 locks. Were these locks connected to the seals? Was it possible they were the Starlight Legion? The armor description had mentioned 7 warriors. And was the giant knight's missing head one of the 7 guarding them? Or was he completely wrong about everything, leaping to conclusions and forcing connections where none existed? Sonny sighed, knowing that his curiosity would not be quenched anytime soon. He had too little information to make a proper theory. He could always talk this over with someone, Nephis or Cassia. He doubted Nephis would have any more insight than he would, but Cassia might already know the answers. Sonny turned to stare at the girl who he once regarded as helpless and innocent. She was huddled by the campfire, warming herself. What was she hiding from him? He couldn't just accept that she knew best. He needed to figure out what Cassia was up to, and if she wouldn't tell him the truth, he may have to get creative. In the evening, Sonny continued to practice with the sword under Nephis's watchful eye. With his new insight, every movement felt different from before. After the 1,000 strikes were finished, he sat down to rest and studied the azure blade, tempted to continue obsessing over the abundant mysteries of the forgotten shore. Sonny glanced over towards Nephis.
Do you think I'm well suited to use a sword? Should I consider switching weapons in the future?
Nephis shrugged. That depends on your goals. However, the sword is considered to be the king of weapons for a reason. Sonny smiled.
And why is that?
She tilted her head and deliberated for a few seconds. Do you know how natural selection works? He raised an eyebrow.
Survival of the fittest? The strongest species survives.
Changing Star chuckled softly. Somewhat correct. But actually, it's not the strongest species that survives. It's the most adaptable. Otherwise, lions and tigers and bears would have been the ones ruling the world, instead of humans. Sonny knew about lions and bears from archival footage, but he had no idea what a tiger was. He figured it must be some other extinct predator. Meanwhile, Nephis was brimming with excitement, not at all like her usual taciturn self. She seemed to be eloquent and confident. He hadn't seen her this way since she was recounting the story of Odysseus to him. The same logic can be applied to combat. A sword is not the most effective tool in every situation. A spear is more useful against enemies with a long reach. A warhammer is much better against armor. A mace is easier to maintain. However, swords are the most versatile. She cast a gaze at the azure blade. The sword can pierce, it can cut, it can bash. It can be used effectively at a variety of ranges. It is swift and maneuverable. Every part of the sword, from tip to pommel, can be used to attack. While wielding a sword, you won't be the best at everything, but you'll be the most adaptable. Nephis turned to him. Do you understand? Sonny thought for a bit before answering.
I think I do.
She gave him a nod and looked away. But in the end, you must remember one thing. It doesn't matter that much what's in your hands. A sword, a spear, a club. That's just tools. You are the weapon. He sighed and dismissed the azure blade. As always, Changing Star's lesson gave him a lot to think about. He was a weapon. He'd never really thought of himself that way before. You are the weapon. He repeated it in his mind, feeling as though another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Together they watched the sunset in comfortable silence. As the night approached, the sea was coming back, flooding the crimson labyrinth like a rush of darkness. Far below them, scavengers were scurrying to find a hiding place. A few of them were climbing the cliffs, hoping to spend the night on the small island. Sonny's shadow was keeping an eye on them. We're going to have guests soon, he said, disheartened at the thought that their short respite was about to end. Nephis sighed. That's all right. With the higher ground advantage, dealing with them won't be too hard. Sonny nodded and looked at the disappearing sun. Suddenly, his mood turned solemn. Doubt raised its ugly head, plunging his mind into the gloomy embrace of anxiety. Staring into the distance, Sonny hesitated.
Do you think we'll be able to reach that castle?
She glanced at him with no particular expression on her face. Yes. He turned to her and forced a smile.
Why are you so sure?
In the blood-red blaze of the sunset, Changing Star's calm eyes seemed to burn with heavenly fire. Looking west, she summoned her sword. If that is our will, who dares to stop us? Sonny swallowed a lump in his throat. In that moment, he truly believed that there was not a monster or force in this world that could stand in Changing Star's way if she were determined, and he found himself quite glad that they'd been thrown together by the spell. Dealing with the climbing scavengers, indeed, turned out to be comparatively easy. Sonny and Nephis had to ambush and push the bulky creatures off the cliff before they could find a stable purchase. Sonny received 4 shadow fragments practically for free, increasing the overall number to 32. Sadly, the soul shards couldn't be retrieved. They spent another day on the cliffs, resting and training. Sonny practiced with the sword while his shadow explored the nearby paths of the labyrinth. With the echo still recovering, their group was not in its optimal condition. That's why there was no point in hastily abandoning their current camp. However, very soon they were going to resume the journey west, moving from one height to another in hopes of reaching the mysterious human citadel. This time, they were going to travel with sufficient preparations, knowing that a sudden storm could come at any moment, covering the world with darkness and summoning the sea back before sunset. The 3 sleepers decided to thoroughly scout a route before committing to moving their camp to the next landmark. Nephis spent the day meditating. Her eyes were closed. From time to time, it seemed as though a soft white glow was radiating from behind her eyelids. However, when Sonny looked closely, it was always gone, making him think that he was just imagining things. He suspected that Changing Star was training herself to endure the pain of her flaw. If so, he wished her luck. Cassia behaved like her usual self, being cheerful and friendly. It was as though their strange conversation had never happened. However, Sonny could feel that something about her was different. He couldn't quite put a finger on what exactly had changed about the blind girl, but she seemed to possess more resolve. It wasn't a bad thing. They spent some time chatting and remembering their time in the academy. Sonny told her about his lessons with Teacher Julius and various strange things he had learned from the old man. Her reaction to the idea of studying dead languages of the dream realm was exactly the same as Sonny's initial protest and bewilderment. Soon, the night was upon them again. This time, no scavenger tried to climb the cliffs, so Sonny and Nephis could rest easy. However, they still slept in turns, keeping watch over the camp in case something unexpected happened. In the morning, Nephis made breakfast and distributed it among the trio. "This is the last of the Centurion meat." Sonny sighed. He knew what that meant. "Which means we need to head out today." Cassia sounded worried. "But are we ready?" Nephis frowned. "We are ready when we have to be, and we have to be now." The teens finished the rest of their meal in silence. No one was feeling in a particularly chatty mood. Life in their camp hadn't been a luxury, but it was safe, and safety was not guaranteed in the labyrinth. In fact, each time they ventured forth, they seemed to discover new dangers. Sonny prayed that the pattern wouldn't hold to be true as they made their way down the statue and back into the dreaded maze. But in his heart, he knew regardless of his wishes, the journey was bound to be treacherous. Days later, Sonny was sitting on top of a dead scavenger, calmly cleaning the azure blood off his face. The spell's all-too-familiar voice announced,
"Your shadow grows stronger."
Sonny's sword was still stuck between the plates of chitin armor, trembling silently as the beast's body convulsed before falling still. Somewhere behind him, the sound of breaking carapaces announced that Nephis was already digging out soul shards from the corpses of the creatures they had slain. After dozens of such battles, the two of them were nothing if not efficient. Glancing back, he evaluated the scene of carnage. The path between 2 crimson walls was littered with corpses. Initially, they were simply planning to lure the carapace centurion that had been tracking them for the past few days into this narrow passage to turn its size against the monster. However, things quickly took a turn. Attracted by the noise of the battle, both the scavengers and the weird centipede creatures that were waging war against the Carapace Legion in this part of the labyrinth showed up to join the fight. In the ensuing mayhem, Sunny and Nephis used the animosity between the two tribes of monsters to their advantage and ended up as the only victors. Not far from him, the Echo was mutilating the corpse of the Centurion. Its lost arm had long grown back. Now, the scavenger was tearing pieces of monster meat with its new pincer and vindictively devouring them. Technically, an Echo wasn't supposed to experience hunger. This one, however, had seemingly acquired a hatred for Carapace Centurions after their encounter with the massive Scythe Slayer on that fateful stormy night. It had already been 2 weeks since they left the cliffs. In that time, many things had changed, while many remained the same. Moving from one high point to another, they steadily traveled west. With Cassia riding atop the Echo, the speed of the group was dramatically enhanced. Still, they took care to explore paths to their next stop before committing to a day-long journey. This way, the risk of being caught in another storm was minimalized, as they could always either reach the next landmark in time or return to the previous one. Their approach to traveling through the labyrinth had also changed. In the past, Nephis and Sunny tried to avoid the scavengers, resorting to fighting them only if there was no other choice. However, the battle with the Centurion opened their eyes to the fact that they desperately needed to become stronger and do it fast. That's why they began to actively hunt the Carapace beasts, taking out any creatures that were either completely isolated or moving in groups of 3 or fewer. The idea of 2 sleepers consciously seeking out nightmare creatures of the awakened rank was pretty ridiculous. But somehow, they made it work. Just as Nephis had said, both of them were abnormal. Clad in the Starlight Legion armor, Changing Star, who had always been an extremely formidable fighter, was now able to showcase the full extent of her combat ability. Simply put, she was a menace. It seemed as though her silver sword had a mind of its own. Whenever the tall figure in white armor appeared, rivers of azure blood were sure to flow. What's more, Neph's powers grew with each soul shard she consumed. Every increase was barely noticeable, but with dozens of them added up together, the difference was apparent. She was slowly approaching the line between the peak of human physical form and the threshold of superhuman prowess. The same could be said about Sunny, although in his case it was predicated on the timely use of the shadow. His own body had become considerably stronger due to the rigors of the Dream Realm, but it was still far away from reaching its peak potential. While Nephis was growing more powerful through the consumption of soul shards, he was quickly collecting shadow fragments. Of course, he wasn't able to get every kill, so their amount was less than that of the shards. But he also didn't have to share them with Cassia, which Changing Star was continuously doing. As a result, the rate of their progress was more or less the same. However, the slow accumulation of power was not the only factor that influenced the rapid growth of their combat effectiveness. Sunny's skill level and battle sense were also improving by leaps and bounds. Under the tutelage of sword goddess Nephis herself, he was quickly learning the ins and outs of wielding the blade. Then he was forced to apply these lessons to practice, participating in bloody battles each day with his life on the line. This brutal, merciless reality was, for better or worse, the best training grounds for a true fighter. There was no room for mistakes, only progress, because a single mistake would most likely become his last. One real fight was worth 1,000 hours of training. With experience, Sunny was able to gain knowledge. With clarity, he was able to turn this knowledge into a seed of understanding. But even that wasn't the biggest contributor to the dramatic increase in the group's overall might. The main culprit was, to his endless surprise, teamwork. After fighting side by side for so long, Sunny and Nephis had developed a tacit, intuitive understanding. Without the need for words and signals, they were able to act in unison with each other, perfectly coordinating their attacks and actions to better control the battlefield and destroy their opponents. The importance of this unity was hard to overestimate. With proper cooperation, it was as though their numbers doubled. The effect was immediate and overwhelming, at least as long as they chose their battles carefully. It was nothing short of jolly. With all this added up together, Their group had turned from a trio of lost kids into a cohort of well-equipped, experienced, and battle-hardened survivors. Even Cassia was becoming stronger. Apart from the boost she had received from absorbing the soul shards, the blind girl was also slowly learning to live and function with her disability. After all, it was less than 2 months since she lost her sight. Cassia was still adapting to her condition, and she was doing an incredible job, considering the circumstances. Sonny remembered how he had initially written Cassia off as doomed and felt a pang of guilt. She was still unable to help them in a fight against the monsters, but the burden of taking care of her was becoming less and less heavy. Sonny had also grown accustomed to it, even finding the time spent watching over the blind girl somewhat calming. The goal of reaching the human castle did not seem as impossible as it had before. Sonny reasoned they must be getting closer. They'd been traveling for so long that they were bound to come upon it soon, if it existed. Their only evidence of this mysterious human settlement remained Cassia's visions, which was a big question mark to Sonny. He didn't know how certain they were to come to pass, or how far in the future she was able to glean. He felt his heart skip a beat at the thought that perhaps she'd had a vision of a month, maybe a year into the future. Even if he and Nephis had become a well-oiled machine, the sheer monotony of wandering this maze for that long would drive Sonny insane. They had to be close to the castle. They simply had to be. Right? Jumping off the dead scavenger, Sonny retrieved his sword. He whistled, letting Cassia know that it was safe to come out. Soon, she crawled from a small opening in the coral wall and carefully put her feet on the ground. Leaning on her staff, the blind girl stood up and slightly turned her head, listening to the light sound of his footsteps. Sonny approached Cassia and took her hand, gently placing it on his shoulder. Then, carefully avoiding puddles of blood, he guided the blind girl to the echo.
Did those centipedes show up?
Sonny answered without turning back.
Yeah, 6 of them, and a few scavengers too. We let them fight each other and then finished off the survivors.
During their journey through the labyrinth, the trio discovered that the scavengers were not the only creatures populating it. Different types of monsters lived in the Crimson Forest, hiding inside the reefs during the night and coming out to hunt once the sun was up. There were sentient colonies of carnivorous worms that attacked from beneath the black mud, flesh-eating flowers that strangled their prey with blood-sucking vines, and weird, transparent tentacles that they had once seen dragging a desperately resisting scavenger into a dark, cavernous crevice. They still didn't know what type of creature had been hiding in that crevice. Sonny hoped that they would never find out. In short, the labyrinth was home to all kinds of horrors. Every one of them at least the awakened rank. They were all carrion eaters, living off the remains left behind by the monsters of the Dark Sea. Given the opportunity, they were also more than willing to devour each other, not to mention the 3 juicy humans. Luckily, the Carapace Legion turned out to be extremely territorial and seemed to have the upper hand in this region of the Crimson Reef. While their armor, size, and physical strength made the scavengers formidable opponents, dealing mostly with one type of creature was infinitely better than constantly facing unknown danger. The centipede monsters were the latest enemy of the Carapace Legion they had met. Some of these critters were more than 3 meters long, with glistening red chitin and hundreds of tiny scurrying legs. They were abhorrently fast and agile, being able to move through mud, climb the coral walls, and even drop on unsuspecting victims from above with incredible speed. What's worse, their bodies were able to secrete a corrosive black oil that melted through the strongest armor in seconds. The only redeeming quality of the centipede monsters was that their chitin shells weren't very tough and could be easily pierced by a sword. Unable to see, Cassia could only imagine what this plethora of monstrosities looked like. She prayed the dream realm wasn't always so dark and deadly. Cassia stuck close to Sonny's heels.
Were you hurt?
Sonny shrugged.
Nothing our armor couldn't handle.
Cassia's voice rang out behind him.
What about the Centurion?
He glanced at the half-devoured carcass and smiled.
It's not going to bother us again.
This was the second awakened monster he and Nephis had slain after entering the dream realm. Compared to the first encounter, this battle went much smoother. No one died, no one was seriously injured. The Echo even kept both of its pincers. Cassia continued her inquisition.
How many soul shards did we get?
Sunny counted.
Should be 11.
Now it was Cassia's turn to smile.
That's our biggest haul so far. By a lot.
He nodded.
Yeah.
However, they had once again failed to receive a memory. Sunny wasn't sure if his bad luck was to blame, but neither he nor Nephis had been able to acquire a single one for the past 2 weeks. It was almost as though the spell had decided that they had already gotten enough. But Sunny scoffed at that idea. He and Nephis had been facing incredible odds, and coming out on top time and time again. They deserved a reward. Sunny and Cassia had developed a kind of game during their downtime. Normally, when they were at camp, the two would eagerly speculate about what they'd buy when they got back in the real world. They'd take turns listing more elaborate and bizarre luxuries. It was mostly a joke, but there was true desire and hope behind it. Memories were worth good money in the real world, but if they couldn't find any, they couldn't auction them off. Consumed by greed and avarice, Sunny approached the Echo and looked up at it with disapproval.
Hey, you! Stop chewing!
The scavenger obediently froze, a piece of meat still hanging from its mouth.
Spit it out!
Shaking his head, Sunny helped Cassia climb to her seat and handed her the reins.
This weirdo gobbled up almost half of the Centurion. What's up with that? Of all the Echoes in the world, why did I have to get stuck with a defective one?
His shadow solemnly nodded, expressing that it completely understood his sentiment. Sunny squinted at it. What a rare show of solidarity. The shadow didn't have any echoes, though. What defective individual was it stuck with? Sunny rolled his eyes.
Cheeky bastard.
Cassia laughed.
Don't badmouth my steed. He is a great Echo. I like him very much.
Sunny pursed his lips together and thought,
It's a he now, huh?
He shook his head again and dropped it. Instead, he focused on stripping the remaining meat off the Centurion's carcass. Then, he placed the meat into the seaweed saddlebags attached to the scavenger. He had made these bags himself to increase the group's carrying capacity. After all, the scavenger was supposed to be extremely strong. Not using it to their advantage would have been an oversight. After that, Sunny sighed and got to the least pleasant task, harvesting the oil sacs from the centipede monster's corpses. Each had 2 of them, connected to a special gland. The whole process was more disgusting than dangerous, since the corrosive effect was only achieved after the liquids from the 2 sacs were mixed. They had not come up with a way to utilize the centipede oil yet, but Nephis insisted on collecting as much of it as possible. She was sure that it was going to be of use one day. At the very least, the oil was highly flammable. Speaking of Nephis, by the time Sunny was done collecting the sacks, she had already gathered all the soul shards and was standing in front of the Echo. Sunny showed her his trophies and carefully placed them in separate saddlebags.
All done?
She nodded. Sunny looked at the sky, trying to determine the time. The sun was right above them, high in the gray sky. There was still plenty of daytime left.
What do you think? We're right in between the flat hill and the Bone Ridge. Should we return or try to reach the ridge today?
The ground level of the labyrinth was not uniform. Some parts of it were situated higher than others. Currently, they are in one such area. The dark sea was much more shallow here, which meant that more natural features remained above the water during the night. That made for a shorter distance between them. Nephis thought for a bit, then said, "Let's push to the Bone Ridge." They had already scouted most of the way to it yesterday, so there wasn't much danger of getting lost in the labyrinth and not making it on time. With the Carapace Centurion dead, the unpredictable element that had been making their lives harder for these past few days was also gone. Considering this, Changing Star's decision seemed proper. Sunny nodded.
Okay.
With that, he sent his shadow forward. Sometime later, they were approaching the Bone Ridge. The sun was preparing to set, but there was still enough time to get to safety. Sunny, however, felt alarmed and uncomfortable. This feeling began to pursue him soon after they had left the cliffs. It always appeared close to the evening and persisted until the last minutes of the sunset, then disappeared, leaving him puzzled and uneasy. The further west they traveled, the stronger the feeling became. It was as though something was not quite right with the world during that time. But no matter how hard Sonny tried to understand what that wrongness was, he couldn't. In the end, he decided to share his uneasiness with the group. After listening to him, the girls were surprised. It seemed that they did not notice anything strange. Even Cassia, whose affinity to revelations provided her with an incredible intuition, didn't experience the strange feeling. However, she did suggest a theory. Since Sonny was the only one susceptible to the feeling, it was logical to assume that there was something unique about him that made it possible. And the only difference he had from the girls in terms of perception was his shadow sense. This meant that the source of the wrongness, most likely, had something to do with the behavior of shadows. Guided by her advice, Sonny was finally able to understand the reason for his discomfort. As it turns out, Cassie was right. In the hours closest to sunset, when the sun was hanging low in the western skies, a vast shadow moved through the labyrinth, affecting his senses and making his skin crawl. The shadow was too distant and colossal to be seen, but he could still feel its presence. When he told Cassia, she took a deep breath. The normally giddy girl had a very serious expression and looked pale. Sonny was alarmed.
What? What is it?
Cassia's voice was flat.
That is the shadow of the Crimson Spire.
Initially, it took Sonny a couple of seconds to realize what Cassia was talking about. Judging from her reaction, this news was grave, but the Crimson Spire meant nothing to him. Then he remembered.
The spire from your vision. The one with 7 seals.
Cassia nodded.
Yes. In my dream, it seemed to be as tall as a mountain. I could even see it from the walls of the human castle, looming in the distance like a crimson spear piercing the skies. When the sun sets, the spire's vast shadow falls over the castle and stretches east, as far as you can see.
She paused for a moment for Sonny to process, but before he could ask any questions, she jumped back in.
The feeling I got when looking at the Crimson Spire was very similar to what you described, only much more intense.
Sonny frowned, trying to remember the exact words Cassia had used to describe her vision. 7 severed heads guarding 7 seals. A dying angel being devoured by hungry shadows. Feeling of extreme terror and loss. What was the deal with that spire exactly?
Is it crimson because it's made out of the same stuff as the labyrinth?
The crimson coral surrounding them was not in fact coral. It's just what they called it based on some resemblance for the sake of simplicity. The actual nature of the strange material remained a mystery. Cassia hesitated.
Maybe it's the other way round. Maybe the labyrinth is made from the same stuff as the spire.
In other words, the Crimson Spire might have been the source of all this madness. Still, it was just a theory. There was too little information to confirm it. However, Sonny did feel that the spire was, in one way or another, at the center of all things that they had encountered. He just hoped that it wouldn't be their final destination. Knowing the reason behind his restlessness, Sonny was able to endure it much better. He even found a hidden benefit to this situation. As long as he sensed the shadow of the Crimson Spire, he could pinpoint the direction to the human castle, since it was situated somewhere between their location and the source of the shadow. In a sense, the Crimson Spire had become his inner compass. Neff's voice took Sonny out of his reverie. Get ready. Shaking off the distracting thoughts, he focused on the task at hand. They were getting close to the Bone Ridge. This name came to their minds as soon as they had first laid their eyes on this towering landmark. It was visible from quite a distance, sharply contrasted against the crimson coral and the gray sky in all its ivory splendor. The Bone Ridge was, in fact, made of bone. The skeletal remains of a colossal sea monster lay on an enormous mound of chaotically growing coral. With its arching spine protruding especially high above the ground, it was impossible to say what the terrifying creature had looked like while it was still alive. But one thing was certain. It was gargantuan, even by the standards of the Dark Sea. This wasn't the first giant skeleton they saw during their journey. In fact, the labyrinth was littered with the remains of dead leviathans, their massive bones forming natural arches and palaces throughout it. They were easy to spot because the coral formations were especially tall and dense in their vicinity, as though trying to bury any sign of whiteness in the sea of crimson. Sonny, however, had a feeling that the situation was actually reversed. To him, it seemed as though the coral was actually growing out of the old bones and spreading in every direction, slowly consuming the world. When he looked at the crimson mounds surrounding the colossal remains, he couldn't help but see them as rivers of ancient solidified blood. He was almost sure that if they were to dig deep enough into the black mud to find the roots of the crimson forest, they would find nothing but endless layers of bones. What a scary image. Regardless of what Sonny thought about the nature of the labyrinth, the beast whose remains formed the bone ridge was especially large. Thanks to that, a portion of its long spine was tall enough to remain above the water during the night. That's why they had chosen it as the next stop on their journey. With the evening approaching, the next task was crucial. They had to scale the dead Leviathan and make sure that no other creature had decided to take shelter in its remains. If something did, they had no choice but to try and kill it, since there was no time to retreat to their previous safe haven. The last step was often the riskiest. Coming to the base of the coral mound, the group moved up around it, searching for a convenient path up. Eventually, they arrived in front of the creature's cracked, misshapen skull. With its lower jaw missing or buried under the mud, the upper formed a vast, cavernous cave. Feeling shivers running down his spine, Sonny passed beneath the terrifying palisade of teeth and entered the cave. With his shadow leading the way, they made their way to the back of the creature's skull and soon entered the hollow expanse of its spine. Inside the spine, the bone surface under their feet was as wide as a road. Actually, it looked a lot like a highway running through a long tunnel with stark beams of light falling through the gaps between the massive vertebrae. The tunnel was inclined upward, most of its length hidden behind the bend of the ceiling. When the echo entered the spine, its chitin legs produced a loud, echoing clatter. Nephis grimaced. Any movement? Sonny checked with the shadow and shook his head. Changing Star looked forward and slightly lowered her chin. Let's proceed. Despite the fact that the shadow had not noticed any danger, they still summoned their swords before moving forward. It was not their first time being ambushed at the edge of safety. Luckily, their precautions turned out to be unnecessary. Nothing was hiding inside the gargantuan remains, so they were able to reach the highest point of the spine without having to cut their way through an unknown number of monsters. By the time they got to safety, the sun was already setting. The dark sea was returning, filling the inside of the sea monster's spine with the echoing sound of rushing water. Sonny took the saddlebags off the echo and dismissed it, making their camp instantly feel much roomier. All three of them were in desperate need of a bath. Leaving the girls alone to give them an opportunity to wash themselves, Sonny walked some distance away and sat down, letting his tired body rest. His shadow returned to the lower parts of the spine, watching the black, dim water slowly rise and devour the ivory whiteness. He had to make sure that nothing would crawl out of the water at the last minute. With half of his mind preoccupied with observing the rising tide, the other half was free to wander. Sonny summoned the runes and checked the number of shadow fragments in his possession. The runes read, Shadow fragments, 96 out of 1,000. Not bad. He only had 12 at the beginning of all this. In less than a month, the amount increased dramatically. He was stronger and faster now. He was also more experienced. However, that still left him far inferior to even the weakest nightmare creatures of the Forgotten Shore in terms of raw physical might. Even with the help of the shadow, he wondered how long it would be before he could wrestle one of those scavengers with his bare hands. The answer was pretty obvious, not to mention extremely disappointing. Not before his own shadow core had awakened, which could only happen after returning to the real world. Sonny sighed. Soon it was his turn to wash. Taking the bottle of endless water from refreshed Rosie Cassia, he walked back to his secluded spot and dismissed the puppeteer's shroud. A cold breeze touched his pale skin, making Sonny shiver. He looked down, shaking his head at the amount of dirt, sweat, and dried blood that was covering his body. Being an awakened was not the cleanest of professions. While Sonny was washing up, Nephis used the remaining time before nightfall to make a fire and cook some meat. These days, they even had salt to season it. At first, the idea of using the sea salt left behind by the dark sea did not seem very appealing, but after a while, they grew accustomed to it. Salt made every meal they had much tastier. They ate in silence, too hungry and tired to talk. Soon, it was time to sleep. Sonny took the first watch, planning to fit in some sword practice before it was his turn to rest. Going through the motions of the basic kata, he split his mind in two. One part was concentrating on the movements of his body, while the other, smaller part, was observing the surface of the black water through his shadow. In the absence of wind, the dark circle covering the lower part of the spine was strangely calm. This was his first time seeing the black water without the constant undulation of waves, with its surface strangely flat and absolutely still. It looked like a giant mirror, one that was made of pure darkness. It was unnaturally mesmerizing. Suddenly he felt a strong desire to come closer and take a look at his reflection. How strange. That wasn't like him at all, and yet he wanted to look so deeply. He wanted to peer over the edge and see himself. He forced his muscles to stay still despite their needs, their desires. Something about this feeling, this place, was wrong. Very wrong.